Hello everyone, I'm here to help you today, to discuss the world's crime news, and I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching it? Now make yourself comfortable and relax. First story. The scent of roasted turkey filled the air as families gathered in the warm glow of their homes. Laughter echoed through the streets, and the sound of clinking glasses signified gratitude and togetherness. It was a perfect Thanksgiving evening, until it wasn't. A house on Oakwood Avenue stood eerily silent compared to its lively neighbors. Inside, the dining table was set meticulously, with golden plates, polished silverware, and a perfectly cooked turkey resting in the center. However, the family meant to enjoy the feast was nowhere to be found. The silence was soon broken by the creaking of the back door. A shadow moved across the dimly lit hallway, a gloved hand gripping a bloodied knife. The perpetrator had left no signs of forced entry. Everything seemed untouched, except for the dark crimson streaks staining the floor. The trail led to the living room, where a gruesome scene awaited. 3 bodies lay motionless, father, mother, and child, positioned as if they had been enjoying their Thanksgiving dinner moments before. Their faces were frozen in expressions of horror, eyes wide open, reflecting the last thing they had seen before their tragic demise. The killer had staged the scene meticulously, placing the utensils back in their hands and arranging the plates as if the meal had continued uninterrupted. A soft knock on the front door startled the murderer. A neighbor, concerned by the unusual stillness, had come to check in. The intruder swiftly retreated to the shadows, slipping into the darkness just as the neighbor peered through the window. The sight of the lifeless family triggered an immediate call to the authorities, but by the time they arrived, the house had returned to its eerie silence. Outside, the crisp autumn air carried the distant sound of sirens. Somewhere, hidden among the unsuspecting crowd, the killer blended in, another face in the sea of Thanksgiving celebrations, waiting for the next perfect holiday to strike again. Few would argue that in today's world, between people can often be intense, with individuals using relentless tactics to achieve their goals. To some extent, everyone is susceptible to manipulation. But the real question is, how far can it go? A skilled manipulator can completely dominate their target, controlling them like a puppet, stripping them of free will and independent thought. Sometimes their influence is so powerful that they can push someone to commit a serious crime, even taking a life without ever getting their own hands dirty. The case of Kelsey Barrett was unusual and came dangerously close to remaining unsolved. A young mother disappeared from her home on a holiday under mysterious circumstances. Her remains were never found, and the perpetrator went to great lengths to cover their tracks. If not for the testimony of an accomplice in this disturbing case, detectives might never have uncovered the truth. But what was the cost of obtaining this crucial information? The prosecutor called it a deal with the devil. Kelsey Barrett was born on August 31, 1989, in the small town of Woodland Park, located in Teller County, Colorado. She was the youngest of 2 children born to Cheryl and Stephen Barrett. Growing up alongside her older brother Clint in their modest family home, Kelsey had a typical small-town upbringing. From an early age, Kelsey was energetic, optimistic, and always on the move. She was involved in sports and had a wide range of interests. In high school, she developed a strong passion for aviation. She was fascinated by flying and dreamed of soaring through the skies. At the time, many dismissed her ambitions as unrealistic, assuming she would eventually choose a more conventional career. However, Kelsey proved them wrong. She was determined, disciplined, and fully committed to making aviation her life's work. After graduating, she pursued formal training and became a certified flight instructor specializing in small aircraft. She worked at a local aviation club, was known as a highly skilled professional, and truly loved what she did. Her job allowed her to travel frequently and meet new people, and those who knew her described her as cheerful, kind-hearted, and friendly. A woman with a bright smile and an even brighter spirit. However, when it came to her personal life, Kelsey struggled to find the right person. In early 2016, she decided to try online dating. Just a few days after creating her profile, she received a message from a young man named Patrick Frazee. They quickly struck up an easygoing conversation, formed a connection, and soon decided to meet in person. Their relationship progressed rapidly, and by the fall of 2016, Kelsey discovered she was expecting. When she shared the news with Patrick, he was thrilled and proposed to her, an offer she gladly accepted. However, despite their engagement and upcoming addition to the family, the couple continued living separately. Kelsey resided in her own cozy home in a central neighborhood of Woodland Park. While Patrick lived on his family's farm outside of town, he ran the farm with his strong-willed mother, Sheila, where they raised horses and donkeys. Patrick had no intention of moving to the city, as he felt obligated to stay and manage the farm alongside his mother. Meanwhile, Kelsey wasn't comfortable with the idea of living under her future mother-in-law's rules and preferred to maintain her independence. Even after the birth of their daughter, whom they named Kay, Kelsey and Patrick remained in separate households. Their relationship resembled more of a long-distance arrangement. They were still engaged and actively planning their wedding, but their living situation remained unchanged. Kelsey hoped Patrick would agree to buy a home of their own, even if it meant staying close to his mother, as long as they could have their own space. While their relationship was far from ideal, Kelsey never complained. She continued to support Patrick, cared for him, and remained committed to their future together. She also maintained a close bond with her parents and brother, keeping them updated on her life. They spoke almost daily, and her parents were actively involved in helping care for their granddaughter. On November 25th, after 2018, Cheryl Barrett grew increasingly worried. She hadn't been able to reach her daughter for 3 days. The last time they spoke was on November 22nd, Thanksgiving Day. Kelsey had mentioned that she was heading to the store to pick up ingredients for cinnamon rolls and a few other dishes for the holiday meal. She planned to spend the evening with her daughter and fiancé. After that, Cheryl only received a few text messages from Kelsey, but then her phone was turned off. Concerned for her daughter's safety, Cheryl decided to contact the authorities, especially since she was also unable to get in touch with Patrick. Law enforcement responded quickly, arriving at Kelsey's home within 30 minutes. Upon arrival, officers immediately noticed her car parked in the driveway and the front door was unlocked. Neither Kelsey nor her young daughter Kay were inside the house. The scene suggested that Kelsey had left in a hurry. Dirty dishes sat in the sink, utensils and stale cinnamon rolls remained on the table, and some food had already spoiled. A few items were scattered around, and her purse, wallet, and phone were missing. At first glance, there were no obvious signs of forced entry, struggle, or aggressive behavior. However, a missing person report was officially filed and news of Kelsey's disappearance quickly spread across social media and local news outlets. A substantial reward was offered for any information leading to her whereabouts. But despite this, no new leads emerged. The biggest question on everyone's mind was where were Kelsey and her daughter Kay. Investigators turned their attention to Patrick Frazee, Kelsey's fiancé and the father of her child, visiting his family's farm to speak with him. Surprisingly, that's where Kay had been staying the entire time. Patrick appeared caught off guard by the police visit, but cooperated and answered their questions. According to Patrick, he and Kelsey had broken up just days before Thanksgiving, claiming they had grown apart and could no longer see eye to eye. He insisted the split was amicable, and they had agreed to co-parent their daughter. He also stated that Kelsey had given him custody of Kay on Thanksgiving Day, and that the little girl was supposed to stay with him until Monday. Because of this, he hadn't been alarmed by his former fiancé's absence. Patrick claimed that their last interaction had taken place outside. Kelsey had handed over their daughter along with some of her belongings, and they had agreed to meet again on Monday, November 26th. He stated that he hadn't heard from her since. While he said nothing seemed out of the ordinary that day, he noted that Kelsey had been acting anxious and withdrawn in recent weeks. When asked to elaborate, Patrick suggested that Kelsey had been struggling with depression and anxiety for some time. He even implied that she might have chosen to leave on her own accord, mentioning that she owned a firearm, which she had purchased a couple of years prior for personal protection. Investigators later confirmed that Kelsey did in fact legally own a firearm, which she kept in a locked box in her home storage closet. However, during a follow-up search of her house, officers discovered that while the box and some ammunition were still there, the gun itself was missing. While this seemed to support Patrick's claims, authorities were hesitant to jump to conclusions. In an effort to verify his story, Patrick showed detectives his text message conversations with Kelsey to prove that their breakup had been amicable. However, the last message Kelsey had sent him on Thanksgiving morning mentioned her plans to cook dinner and that she was looking forward to seeing him. There was no mention of handing over their daughter for the entire weekend, nor did any of their previous messages suggest a recent separation. Detectives began questioning Patrick's account after speaking with Kelsey's family, friends, and coworkers. To their surprise, no one had heard anything about relationship troubles between Kelsey and Patrick, let alone a breakup. Even more suspiciously, just 2 days before she went missing, Kelsey had been looking at wedding dress catalogs with her mother and cousin, excitedly discussing her upcoming wedding. The night before Thanksgiving, she had even messaged her boss, confirming that she and Patrick would be attending the company's Christmas party together. This meant that Kelsey had been actively planning her wedding up until the last moment. A month before her disappearance, she had even informed her boss that she would be attending the company's Christmas party with her fiancé. None of this aligned with what Patrick had told investigators, but without concrete evidence, authorities had no choice but to release him after questioning. A close friend later came forward with crucial information, revealing that Kelsey and Patrick's relationship had been far from perfect. According to her, Kelsey had recently expressed concerns that Patrick was becoming distant. She suspected he might have rekindled communication with an ex, but despite her suspicions, Kelsey had no intention of ending things. She genuinely believed they could work through their issues and move forward with their wedding plans. News of Kelsey's mysterious disappearance spread rapidly, gaining widespread media attention. Her family and friends were relentless in their search efforts, making public appeals through news outlets and hosting press conferences. However, Patrick remained noticeably absent from these efforts. He gave no interviews, did not participate in any searches, and appeared unconcerned about his fiancée's fate. Determined to find answers, Kelsey's mother, Cheryl, and her brother, Clint, returned to her home for another thorough check. They wanted to see if anything was missing, or if there were any unusual details investigators might have overlooked. Cheryl noticed something odd. While the kitchen was messy, the refrigerator had been wiped down, yet streaks remained, something Kelsey would never have left behind. The floor also appeared unusually clean, which didn't fit the overall state of the house. Additionally, the bathroom rug was missing. Concerned by these details, Cheryl and Clint immediately contacted law enforcement, urging them to re-examine the home. This time, forensic experts arrived with luminol and ultraviolet lamps. Their examination revealed a grim reality. Traces of blood had been meticulously cleaned from the kitchen. The amount was significant, leading experienced investigators to conclude that a violent crime had taken place there. Further traces of blood were also found in the bathroom, though in smaller amounts, suggesting that the perpetrator had likely washed up there after the attack. What stood out was the extent of the cleanup. This wasn't a quick attempt to wipe away evidence. Someone had gone to great lengths to scrub every surface using heavy-duty cleaning agents. Investigators even had to pull up sections of the kitchen floor where they found blood that had seeped into the seams and beneath the flooring. A DNA analysis confirmed that the blood belonged to Kelsey. At this point, the grim truth was almost undeniable. She was no longer alive. With the discovery of substantial forensic evidence, authorities officially reclassified the case as a homicide investigation. The next step was to locate Kelsey's remains and identify the individual responsible for the crime. During this time, detectives learned that a security camera had been installed on a neighboring house with a clear view of Kelsey's driveway and front door. Investigators immediately requested the footage, hoping it would shed light on the events of that day. The recordings exposed major inconsistencies in Patrick's statements. The footage showed that he had visited Kelsey's home twice on the day she disappeared. The first time he arrived with their daughter, Kay. About 30 minutes later, he was seen leaving carrying the little girl in his arms before driving away. An hour later, Patrick returned, this time alone. He entered the house and emerged 20 minutes later carrying something large, which he placed in the trunk of his vehicle. Unfortunately, the surveillance footage was of poor quality, revealing only vague silhouettes. However, it was enough to confirm that Patrick had lied. Kelsey had never handed over their daughter outside, as he had claimed. Instead, he had taken her from inside the house. This raised even more questions. Why had he returned later, and what had he been carrying out? There was still no concrete evidence to charge Patrick, but he remained the primary suspect. Notably, his total time inside Kelsey's home across both visits was less than an hour. If he had indeed committed a crime, this would not have been enough time for even a basic cleanup, let alone a thorough one. This led investigators to suspect that he may have had an accomplice. But who? A search was conducted at Patrick's home and the surrounding property, but no evidence was found. However, authorities noted that a new horse barn was under construction on the land and large sections of soil had been freshly dug. These areas would require a more detailed investigation. Kelsey's phone was turned off the evening after her disappearance, but until then, text messages had continued to be sent from her number to friends and family. Investigators suspected that the person responsible for her disappearance was trying to create the illusion that she was still alive. They decided to track the phone's movements until it was powered down, and this provided a major breakthrough. It turned out that on Thanksgiving Day and the following day, Kelsey's and Patrick's phones had been detected in the same location. Even more importantly, by the evening of the second day, both phones had pinged in Caldwell, Idaho. But what was Patrick doing there? Detectives soon uncovered a connection. Caldwell was home to a woman named Crystal Lee Kenny, a nurse who had been involved in an on and off relationship with Patrick for the past 10 years. When law enforcement visited Crystal, she initially denied any significant relationship with Patrick, claiming she had only met him a few times when she visited his ranch to purchase horses. However, when confronted with phone records and message logs, she admitted that they had been romantically involved, though she struggled to define their exact relationship. Crystal revealed that Patrick had frequently spoken negatively about Kelsey, portraying her as an unfit mother. He claimed that she suffered from mental health issues, used alcohol and banned substances, and displayed aggressive behavior. According to him, he was trying to protect his daughter from Kelsey and was determined to gain full custody. Believed Patrick completely, even though everything he had said about Kelsey was a fabrication. As a professional in the aviation industry, Kelsey was subjected to strict medical examinations, including routine psychiatric evaluations. If she had ever tested positive for alcohol or banned substances, or if a psychiatrist had flagged her as mentally unfit, she would have been grounded immediately. It also became evident that Patrick had an unusual hold over Crystal, manipulating her for his own benefit. Both her mother and ex-husband confirmed this. Would drop everything to come to Patrick's aid. She gave him money, never as a loan, but simply as a gift, and she fulfilled all his demands without question. This level of control had ultimately contributed to the breakdown of her marriage. It was still unclear whether Crystal had played a direct role in the crime, or what her exact involvement might have been. Most importantly, the motive behind Kelsey's disappearance remained a mystery. Patrick had not been openly arguing with his fiancée, and according to friends and family, their relationship seemed stable, with wedding preparations actively underway. So what could have gone wrong? As it turned out, Patrick, who thrived on control and manipulation in relationships, had struggled to dominate Kelsey, an independent and strong-willed woman. She was determined to live life on her own terms, refused to move to his mother's ranch, and never saw eye-to-eye with his family. Kelsey had a natural leadership quality, something that seemed to infuriate Patrick, who was used to being the one in charge. Investigators also uncovered another potential motive. In August 2018, Patrick had encountered serious financial trouble after investing in the construction of an additional horse barn. He had taken on debt, secured a loan, and was struggling to stay afloat. In September, many of his horses fell ill, resulting in expensive veterinary bills that worsened his financial situation. Around this time, he had persuaded Kelsey to take out a life insurance policy, supposedly to secure their daughter's future. The payout amount was set at nearly $250,000, with Patrick named as the sole beneficiary. This presented a chilling motive. If Kelsey were to disappear, Patrick could easily claim she had taken her own life due to alleged mental health struggles, all while collecting the insurance payout. Despite extensive searches at Patrick's home and ranch, investigators found no trace of Kelsey, no remains, no personal belongings, nothing. The investigation seemed to be at a standstill. With no solid evidence linking Patrick to the crime, authorities decided to take another approach. They turned their attention back to Crystal, hoping to pressure her into revealing what she knew. During questioning, detectives laid out all the evidence they had against her, the phone records, the surveillance footage, inconsistencies, and her documented ties to Patrick. They made it clear that if Patrick was convicted, she could be charged as an accomplice, potentially facing a lengthy prison sentence, possibly even life behind bars. After careful consideration, made a fateful decision. She agreed to cooperate in exchange for a plea deal. In return for testifying and revealing the full disturbing details of the case, she would face only minimal charges with a significantly reduced sentence. The prosecution would later call this agreement a deal with the devil. But without Crystal's testimony, the case likely would have remained unsolved. Crystal's connection to Patrick went back more than a decade. Throughout the years, they had maintained an on-again, off-again relationship, though it was far from stable. Patrick dictated the terms, deciding when they would be together and when their relationship would end. He used Crystal to serve his own needs, and she, seemingly unable to resist his influence, continued to comply, even when it came at great personal cost. In the months leading up to Kelsey's disappearance, Patrick began portraying her in an extremely negative light, painting her as someone dangerous and unstable. He confided in Crystal that Kelsey needed to be taken care of, and even convinced her to carry out the act herself. Initially, Patrick planned to poison Kelsey. Crystal was supposed to purchase a toxic substance, mix it into Kelsey's coffee, and deliver it to her at work along with lunch. When that plan failed, Patrick devised a new one. This time he pressured Crystal to break into Kelsey's home and attack her. However, Crystal refused, fearing she wouldn't be able to go through with it. Despite this, Patrick still managed to manipulate her into helping him cover up the crime and dispose of evidence. On Thanksgiving Day, Patrick promised Kelsey they would spend the holiday together with their daughter. They went grocery shopping and then returned to Kelsey's home. While their daughter was asleep upstairs, Patrick suggested that Kelsey put on a blindfold, telling her he had a surprise for her. Trusting him, she agreed. But the moment her vision was obscured, she felt a powerful blow to the head, then another and another. Patrick struck her with a baseball bat with such force that blood splattered across the furniture and walls. Kelsey tried to scream, begged him to stop, but he continued until she was silent. Once it was over, he washed his hands, took his daughter, drove to his mother's house. On the way, he sent a message to Crystal instructing her to take care of things. This was the signal she had been waiting for, and she immediately got in her car and drove across state lines. Meanwhile, after dropping off his daughter at his mother's house, Patrick returned to Kelsey's home. He took her purse, personal documents, and firearm, then placed her lifeless body in an opaque plastic container, loaded it into the trunk of his car, and transported it to his ranch, where he hid it in a barn. While doing this, he sent text messages from Kelsey's phone, trying to create the illusion that she was alive so that no one in her circle would become suspicious. Crystal stopped at a store on her way, purchasing cleaning supplies, gloves, brushes, and rags. She entered Kelsey's home through the back door using the key Patrick had given her, ensuring she remained unnoticed. She spent several hours scrubbing the house, carefully wiping away every trace of blood. However, she had to make it appear as though Kelsey had left in a hurry, leaving things scattered. She executed her task meticulously, but there was one thing she couldn't fully clean: the bathroom rug. Realizing it was beyond salvaging, she simply threw it away. She then exited the house the same way she had entered. After finishing the cleanup, drove to Patrick's house. She joined his family for Thanksgiving dinner. Later that night, the two of them moved Kelsey's body into a metal trough, along with her purse and phone. They then doused everything in nearly 4 gallons of gasoline and set it on fire. The gruesome cremation process lasted almost the entire night. Patrick and Crystal continued adding fuel to ensure that nothing remained. By morning, they had reduced everything to ash, which they scattered off a remote cliff. Patrick disposed of the weapon separately. According to Crystal, Patrick's mother, Sheila, had been watching everything unfold from the porch of her house. The fact that she showed no reaction or concern suggested that she was fully aware of what was happening. Investigators needed to question her, determine the extent of her involvement, and hold her accountable if necessary. On December 21, 2018, Patrick was arrested and charged with premeditated homicide. He adamantly denied any wrongdoing, but Crystal's testimony proved to be a critical factor in the case. Gathering evidence and building a solid prosecution took nearly a year, so the trial didn't begin until October 2019. While in custody awaiting trial, Patrick attempted to hire someone to silence Crystal, knowing that without her testimony, his chances of walking free would be significantly higher. However, his plan was exposed, further damaging his legal standing. Ultimately, Patrick was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In addition to the life sentence, he received 3 consecutive terms, each spanning several decades, for solicitation of homicide, destruction of remains, and tampering with evidence. He never revealed what he had done with Kelsey's firearm, and the weapon was never recovered. During the trial, a former girlfriend of Patrick's, Vanessa, took the stand. She described him as a manipulator and someone who exhibited controlling and obsessive behavior toward the women in his life. She also suggested that Crystal had likely fallen under his influence, blindly following his orders as if she were under hypnosis. Thanks to her cooperation agreement with prosecutors, Crystal received a reduced sentence, just 3 years in prison with an additional year of probation. Kelsey's family believed this punishment was far too lenient, were unable to challenge it. Due to good behavior, was released on parole in early 2021. As for Sheila, she was also taken into custody, but authorities were unable to prove her involvement. As a result, she was released without charges. Full custody of Kelsey's daughter Kay was awarded to her maternal grandparents. Patrick's mother later attempted to gain custody of her granddaughter, but her request was denied. Second story. Closed relationships are not always defined by family ties. In fact, sometimes the opposite is true. Immediate relatives can become bitter enemies, with minor family disagreements escalating into full-blown conflicts. Such hostility can persist for years, and even be passed down through generations. The mysterious disappearance of Russell and Rebecca Porter from their own home was deeply alarming and suspicious from the very beginning. It was clear they couldn't have simply left without saying a word to anyone, leaving behind all their personal belongings. Moreover, the disorder inside the house pointed to signs of a struggle, as if someone had tried to cover up evidence of a brutal altercation. However, the real shock came when the truth about what had happened and who was behind it finally came to light. You might find yourself stunned as well. In the summer of 2010, Russell and Rebecca Porter moved to the small picturesque town of Willard, Missouri after Russell inherited a large farmhouse from his grandfather. The town was a quiet rural area with a low crime rate, friendly neighbors, and a welcoming atmosphere. However, this peaceful impression would soon prove deceiving. On April 19, 2011, 46-year-old Rebecca failed to show up for work. She hadn't informed anyone of an absence, and her no-show was highly unusual. Calls to her phone went unanswered throughout the day. While her co-workers found this strange, they initially avoided jumping to conclusions, assuming there was some reasonable explanation, and waiting for Rebecca to contact them herself. Around 9:30 a.m., a neighbor noticed Rebecca's car parked in front of the house. This seemed odd, as she typically left for work by 9 a.m. curious. The neighbor decided to knock on the Porter's door to check on them, but there was no response. Assuming the car might have broken down, he guessed that Russell may have driven Rebecca to work and thought little of it. By 1 p.m., Rebecca's daughter Jessica arrived at the house. Concerned after being unable to reach her mother, Jessica decided to drive over and check in person. Around the same time, Rebecca's son Stephen, who had left work early, also showed up worried about the lack of contact with both his mother and stepfather. Jessica and Stephen walked around the house, peering through the windows. They immediately noticed a significant mess inside and saw that the mosquito screen on one of the large windows had been cut. The window itself was open. Alarmed, they called law enforcement right away, but refrained from entering the home themselves. When police arrived and entered the house, they were hit by the strong smell of cleaning products containing chlorine. The interior was in disarray, with belongings scattered across the floor. The master bedroom was in complete chaos. Signs of a violent struggle were apparent. The mattress had been shifted, a nightstand was overturned, a flower pot and a framed photo were shattered on the ground. However, there was no trace of Russell or Rebecca in the house, leaving a faint hope that they might still be alive. In the bedroom, the odor of bleach was overwhelming. The mattress and carpet had been thoroughly saturated with the chemical, and small puddles of it had collected on the floor. This appeared to be a desperate attempt to eliminate evidence. But until the scene could be properly examined and tested, no definitive conclusions could be drawn. The initial theory was that the crime stemmed from a burglary gone wrong. Investigators determined that an intruder, or possibly multiple intruders, had entered the home through an open window after cutting through the mosquito screen. The assumption was that the intruder planned to steal valuables, but was confronted by the homeowners, leading to a violent struggle. However, this theory quickly unraveled due to several inconsistencies. First, all valuable items and cash were left untouched despite being in plain sight. Second, the house showed no signs of a search. Most of the scattered objects appeared to have been knocked over during the altercation. Lastly, the biggest mystery remained. What had happened to Russell and Rebecca Porter? Rebecca's purse was found on the bedroom floor, still containing her wallet, keys, and bank cards. Her phone lay nearby, its screen shattered as though someone had stepped on it. A prescription bottle belonging to Russell was also discovered on the floor. According to Rebecca's daughter, Jessica, Russell relied on this medication daily due to a chronic health condition and rarely left the house without it. The only missing item appeared to be the tower of the family's desktop computer, which had been forcibly removed along with its cables. Law enforcement speculated that this might have been the intruder's primary target, perhaps containing valuable information that could provide access to financial accounts or be used for blackmail. However, this theory was soon dismissed. According to Rebecca's children, the hard drive didn't contain anything of the sort, but it did store other critical data, namely footage from the home's extensive surveillance system, which included over a dozen cameras. As it turned out, the entire Porter property was under constant surveillance with no blind spots. Whoever entered the house had been recorded, and it was evident that the intruder knew this. By removing the computer, they eliminated the primary piece of evidence. This raised another unsettling question. Who, or what had the Porters feared so much that they installed such a comprehensive security system? With no clear direction for the investigation, authorities turned their focus to Russell and Rebecca themselves, attempting to learn more about the couple. What they uncovered painted a picture of a relationship that was both recent and unusual. Rebecca had just celebrated her 46th birthday. She had previously been married and had 2 adult children from that relationship. Russell, on the other hand, was nearly 12 years younger than Rebecca. He had never been married and didn't have any children. Russell had struggled with severe issues in the past, including substance abuse. He had a long history of alcohol dependence and the use of prohibited substances, which he had relied on heavily for years. He had attended rehab several times, but had repeatedly relapsed. Despite his troubled past, Rebecca became a stabilizing force in Russell's life. She not only accepted him as he was, but actively helped him turn his life around. With her support, Russell agreed to enter a treatment program one more time, and this time he completed it successfully. Free from his addictions, Russell proposed to Rebecca, and she happily accepted. Despite Rebecca's role in helping Russell turn his life around, his family was far from thrilled about their marriage. They were openly critical of Rebecca, largely due to the significant age difference between her and Russell, and the fact that she had children from a previous marriage. On the other hand, Rebecca's children initially found it difficult to connect with their much younger stepfather, unsure of how to relate to him. However, over time, they grew closer and even developed a friendly relationship. About 6 months after their wedding, the couple decided to leave the city of Springfield, the county seat where they had previously lived, and moved to Willard. Russell had recently inherited a farmhouse from his grandfather, and the two of them chose to trade the busy city life for the peace and quiet of a rural town. In Willard, the couple quickly became part of the local community. They were friendly, helpful, and well-liked by their neighbors. Both devoutly religious, they attended church every Sunday and were known for their charitable efforts. Neighbors described them as kind, compassionate, and always ready to lend a helping hand. On the surface, it seemed they had no enemies, but this turned out to be far from the truth. According to neighbors, after Russell's grandfather passed away, his younger brother, Rob Campbell, moved into the farmhouse. Rob, despite the existence of a clear will, leaving the property entirely to Russell, believed he was entitled to half of the inheritance. He was also convinced that Russell would never leave the city for a quiet, rural life. Rob and his wife took it upon themselves to move into the house. They began remodeling and redecorating it to their liking, even though they had no legal claim to the property. When Russell finally arrived to claim his inheritance and asserted his legal ownership, Rob refused to leave. Evicting him required police intervention and court orders. Angered and humiliated, Rob filed a lawsuit in an attempt to claim half of the house and land. The court rejected his case, citing the will that left everything to Russell. Undeterred, Rob filed another lawsuit, this time demanding compensation for the money he claimed to have spent on renovations and remodeling. Once again, the court ruled against him, stating that his actions were unauthorized and had not been approved by the property's rightful owner. This series of legal defeats escalated into a bitter feud. Rob began harassing Russell and Rebecca, frequently showing up uninvited and demanding a share of the inheritance. His behavior grew increasingly hostile, with him cursing the couple, making threats, and insisting they wouldn't live in the house for long. Things quickly escalated from verbal threats to outright acts of aggression. The windows of the Porters' home were repeatedly broken during the night, their vehicles were vandalized, and in a particularly cruel act, their dog was poisoned. Feeling unsafe, Russell and Rebecca sought help from the authorities. Although there was no concrete evidence directly tying Rob to these incidents, witness statements from the Porters and their neighbors painted a clear picture of his aggressive behavior. The court ultimately issued a restraining order forbidding Rob from approaching Russell, Rebecca, or their home. About a month before the mysterious disappearance of Russell and Rebecca Porter, someone broke onto their property in the middle of the night and stole expensive farming equipment and tools. Although there was no solid evidence linking Rob Campbell to the theft, the Porters became increasingly concerned about their safety. In response, they installed numerous surveillance cameras around their home, ensuring full coverage of the property. Once these details came to light, Rob immediately became the prime suspect. Investigators located him and brought him in for questioning to learn more about his ongoing conflict with the missing couple and to determine if he had any involvement in their disappearance. The elderly relative adamantly denied having anything to do with Russell and Rebecca's disappearance. Though he couldn't hide his satisfaction at hearing about the troubling situation, Rob openly admitted to his long-standing disputes with the Porters, acknowledging the bitter conflict over the inheritance. However, he insisted that he never wished them harm and only wanted, in his words, justice in the family property dispute. Rob provided a solid alibi for the night of the disappearance. He and his wife had left the day before for a farm equipment expo in a nearby city and stayed there for 3 days. His wife confirmed this account, adding that her husband was a good man who, despite past disagreements, had hoped to reconcile with the Porters and settle their disputes amicably. With no evidence directly implicating him, investigators had no grounds to press charges against Rob. Although some speculated that he might have hired someone else to carry out the dirty work, there was no proof to support this theory. As a result, Rob was cleared of suspicion and released. Detectives expanded their investigation, looking deeper into the lives of the missing couple and considering other people who might have had reasons to harm them. This led them to Rebecca's ex-husband, Terrence, who was also the father of her 2 children. Rebecca and Terrence had been married for 18 years, during which they accumulated significant shared assets. Among their holdings was a profitable restaurant business they had co-owned for many years. When the couple divorced, the restaurant became the main point of contention. Neither Rebecca nor Terrence was willing to sell their share, and neither wanted to give up control of the business. Despite being divorced for over 2.5 years, they had continued running the restaurant together, frequently clashing over decisions. While their disagreements sometimes flared up, they generally maintained a professional relationship for the sake of their family. Both, however, still harbored hopes of one day owning the business outright. When police arrived at Terrence's house, he appeared caught off guard. After officers explained why they were there, his initial confusion turned to visible shock and distress. Terrence insisted that he would never harm the mother of his children and denied having anything to do with her disappearance or that of her husband. Unlike Rob, who had displayed smugness during questioning, Terrence broke down in tears, appearing genuinely devastated by the situation. Terrence also had an alibi for the night Rebecca and Russell vanished, but investigators couldn't ignore his potential motive. If Rebecca were to disappear or pass away, Terrence would gain sole ownership of the restaurant by default. Despite this, there was no evidence tying him to the crime. Without proof of involvement, law enforcement had no grounds to arrest him, and Terrence was released. As previously mentioned, the master bedroom in the Porters' home was drenched in chlorine bleach, which had been used extensively throughout the space. However, investigators only found 1/2 empty bottle of bleach in the house, suggesting that any additional containers had been taken by someone. The cleaning product had clearly been used to destroy evidence, but forensic experts were still able to uncover a few critical traces. Tiny reddish-brown stains were found on the floor, furniture, and walls. Testing confirmed these were traces of blood belonging to Russell Porter. This discovery reinforced investigators' worst fears. The couple was likely no longer alive, but the lingering question remained: who could have done this? Detectives proposed another theory, one that seemed improbable but still plausible enough to investigate. According to this scenario, a domestic dispute between Russell and Rebecca had escalated into a physical altercation. Things turned violent, and the confrontation might have ended in an unintentional killing. This could explain the disarray in the bedroom and the bloodstains. It was suggested that Russell may have attacked Rebecca, leading her to defend herself and injure him in the process, or that Rebecca might have been the aggressor. In either case, one spouse could have attempted to cover up what had happened, disposing of the other's body, taking the surveillance system's hard drive and possibly fleeing the area. When family members of the Porters heard this theory, they were outraged. They vehemently denied that anything of the sort could have happened, insisting that Russell and Rebecca deeply loved each other and had never fought, let alone engaged in physical aggression. Additionally, they questioned why, if one of them had fled, they hadn't taken any personal belongings, such as phones, bank cards, or Russell's essential medication. The evidence clearly suggested a break-in and foul play by a third party, but the investigation still lacked concrete leads or evidence pointing to a specific direction. 2 weeks after Russell and Rebecca's disappearance, another disturbing crime shook the quiet town of Willard. Police received a frantic call from a man who reported finding his elderly neighbors Donald and Helena Willingham brutally killed in their home. When officers arrived at the scene, they discovered the couple had been fatally stabbed in their bedroom. The similarities to the Porter case were immediately apparent. In both instances, the intruder had entered the home at night, catching the victims while they were asleep. In neither case were any valuable items stolen, suggesting that the crimes were driven by personal motives rather than robbery. However, in the Willingham case, the intruder had left the bodies behind, and had not attempted to clean up the evidence. The unsettling parallels between the two crimes raised new questions. Could the same person or group have been involved in both cases? And if so, what was their motive? Investigators doubled their efforts, now searching for connections between the two households and any clues that could shed light on who might have been responsible for these heinous acts. Both cases stalled for nearly 3 months, with no new leads until July 2011. That was when law enforcement's attention shifted to a young man named Jose Huckleberry. Jose was an undocumented migrant who traveled between states committing various offenses. He had been caught during a burglary in Arkansas, a state neighboring Missouri. During an extended interrogation, investigators uncovered details of more disturbing crimes connected to him. As it turned out, Jose had broken into the home of Helena and Donald Willingham several months earlier, intending to rob them. However, when Helena raised the alarm, alerting neighbors, Jose panicked and attacked the elderly couple. One neighbor even chased him as he fled the Willingham residence, but was unable to catch him. Jose admitted to the crime, expressing remorse and sharing grisly details about the incident, details that only the perpetrator could know. Despite his confession regarding the Willingham case, Jose adamantly denied any involvement in the disappearance of Russell and Rebecca Porter. He claimed he had no idea who they were, had never been to their home, and had nothing to do with their case. Investigators found no evidence linking him to the Porters' disappearance, and his alibi for the night they went missing was confirmed. As a result, Jose was ruled out as a suspect. In September 2011, a prison informant provided police with a critical lead in the Porter investigation. The informant claimed to have shared a cell with a repeat offender named Tony Hicks, who was in custody for distributing prohibited substances. According to the informant, Tony boasted about killing a farmer and his wife, adding that no one would ever find their bodies. Initially, detectives were skeptical. They suspected Tony was fabricating the story to bolster his reputation in prison. However, the tip couldn't be ignored, so they brought Tony in for questioning. As expected, Tony immediately denied any involvement with the Porters' disappearance, claiming he had nothing to do with the case. Yet his behavior suggested he was uneasy, and investigators felt they might be onto something significant. A request was made to trace the location of Tony's cell phone on the night the Porters vanished. Records revealed that his phone had pinged near their home, but was turned off around 12:30 a.m. This raised further suspicions. Tony had an extensive criminal history, including convictions for burglary, robbery, possession of weapons, and trafficking prohibited substances. He also frequently carried out his crimes with his younger brother, Dusty, who had been incarcerated for several months at the time of the investigation. This new information gave investigators hope that they were finally closing in on answers about what had happened to Russell and Rebecca Porter. During a subsequent interrogation, Dusty decided to cooperate with the police and claimed he had something important to show them. He revealed that his brother, Tony, had a secret location in the woods that concealed a dark truth. Dusty led detectives to a dilapidated old cabin hidden deep in the forest. As they approached, a sickening odor became noticeable, and upon entering, the stench of decay was overwhelming. Inside the cabin, investigators found a shallow cellar beneath the wooden floorboards. Buried under dirt and debris were 2 heavily decomposed bodies. Detectives suspected the remains belonged to the missing couple, Russell and Rebecca Porter. Given the advanced state of decomposition, more than 4 months had passed since their disappearance. Visual identification was impossible. A DNA analysis was conducted, and it conclusively confirmed that the bodies were indeed those of the Porters. Forensic examination revealed that the couple had been killed by close-range gunshots to the head, likely from a high-caliber weapon. Amount of blood on the wooden floor and walls of the cabin suggested the crime had occurred there. Additionally, Russell had suffered a broken nose and arm, indicating he had put up a fierce struggle in a desperate attempt to protect himself and Rebecca. Their efforts were no match for their attackers, and the couple paid the ultimate price. With this discovery, the case was officially reclassified from a disappearance to a double homicide. Authorities now had their suspects in custody, but needed to determine the motive and piece together the chain of events to fully understand the crime. The fact that the couple was still in their pajamas suggested they had been ambushed while asleep. But how and why did they end up so far from their home? Dusty insisted he had no direct involvement in the murders. He claimed to have only known about his brother's cabin and heard rumors that bodies might be hidden there, but he wasn't certain. However, the investigation uncovered evidence implicating him as an accomplice. It was revealed that Tony had enlisted not only Dusty's help, but also that of his common-law wife, Wendy, and their 19-year-old son, Philip, all of whom had ties to criminal activity. Cell phone records placed all 4 suspects near the Porters' home on the night of their disappearance. All 4 phones were powered off almost simultaneously, further raising suspicion. Tony, who was aware of the Porters' surveillance system, cut the exterior camera cable. This triggered a security alert to the monitoring service, but for reasons still unclear, the alert was never followed up on. The group entered the home by cutting through the screen on an open window. They made their way to the bedroom where Russell and Rebecca were sleeping. Tony, armed with a weapon, ordered the couple to get up. When the intruders attempted to restrain the Porters with zip ties, Russell unexpectedly resisted, leading to a violent struggle during which he sustained a broken nose and arm. Ultimately, the attackers managed to subdue the couple, tying them up before forcing them out of the house. They were loaded into a pickup truck belonging to the Hicks family and driven to the remote cabin in the woods. Once there, the Porters were executed with single gunshots to the head. The bodies were hastily dumped in the shallow cellar, partially covered with dirt and debris. This chilling account shed light on the fate of Russell and Rebecca Porter. But investigators were left to unravel why these individuals had targeted the couple and whether more individuals might have been involved. The perpetrators returned to the victim's home after the crime to destroy any evidence that could implicate them and retrieve the computer tower containing footage from the surveillance cameras. These recordings could have captured the suspects and their vehicle. The bedroom was thoroughly cleaned with bleach, which they had brought with them, and the empty bottles were taken away. When Tony was asked why they committed such a heinous crime, he revealed that there had been a client who offered him $100,000 to make the Porters disappear without a trace. Tony admitted he was eager to accept the job, but feared he couldn't handle 2 adults on his own. To ensure success, he recruited a team of family members who were all struggling financially. The mysterious client turned out to be Robert Campbell, the uncle who had long coveted the farm left to Russell by his grandfather. Robert provided detailed instructions, including information about the surveillance cameras, and even paid in advance of $20,000. He carefully crafted an alibi, taking his wife on a trip to another city for several days. Investigators later discovered that his wife was aware of his plan. Law enforcement arrested the client and all 4 participants, charging them with premeditated double homicide, conspiracy, evidence tampering, and perjury. Each suspect tried to minimize their involvement, but none were able to escape justice. In April 2013, 2 years after the brutal crime, Tony and Dusty Hicks were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Tony's wife, Wendy, also received a life sentence. Their son, who had cooperated with investigators and confessed his role in the crime, was sentenced to 13 years in prison. As for Robert Campbell, he adamantly denied his involvement, and much of the evidence against him was circumstantial, leading to delays in his trial. However, in the summer of 2016, the elderly man was finally convicted and sentenced to life in prison. His wife, who had been charged with aiding and abetting as well as perjury, did not live to stand trial. She tragically took her own life shortly after Robert's arrest. Story 1. In the early 1990s, Southeast Asia experienced a number of significant criminal activities that shook the region. Among the most notorious was the crime carried out by a group of individuals in the Philippines that would become one of the most talked about cases of the decade. This case involved a combination of gang violence, kidnapping, and organized crime. At the heart of the case were a group of criminals known as the Akayatbi Gang, a notorious group involved in robberies, extortion, and other violent crimes. The group was well organized, and its members were feared for their ruthlessness and efficiency in carrying out their illegal activities. The leader of the Akayatbi Gang, whom we will identify as Ramon, was a man with a troubled background. He had grown up in one of the most impoverished areas of Manila, surrounded by violence and crime. Early on, he was exposed to the world of organized crime, which led him to a life of criminal activity. Ramon, with his charisma and strategic mind, quickly rose to the top of the criminal underworld. Ramon was not acting alone, however. His gang was composed of several key figures, each with their specialized roles. One such individual was Julius, the group's most experienced enforcer. Julius was known for his brutal methods and was often tasked with ensuring that no one escaped during robberies. He had a long history of violent crime and was said to be responsible for several deaths before joining Ramon's gang. His loyalty to Ramon was unwavering, and he was feared by many due to his cold-hearted approach to dealing with victims. Another important member of the gang was Mia, the only female member, who acted as the group's informant and recruiter. Mia's role was crucial because she was responsible for scouting wealthy families or businesses that were potential targets for the gang. Mia had connections in high society and used these connections to gain valuable information about the wealth and security of potential targets. She was highly intelligent and skilled in deception, often using her charm to blend in with various social circles. The Akayatbi Gang operated mainly in Metro Manila, though they had networks that extended to other parts of the country. They were known for their house burglary technique, where they would target homes in affluent neighborhoods, break in while the families were asleep, and steal valuables. Over time, their activities escalated, and they became involved in more serious crimes, including kidnapping for ransom. It was in 1992 that the Akayatbi Gang became the subject of a high-profile investigation following the kidnapping of a prominent businessman's family. The businessman, Alfonso Reyes, was a wealthy tycoon who owned a chain of successful retail businesses. His family was abducted from their home in the middle of the night, with the perpetrators demanding a substantial ransom for their safe return. The kidnapping sent shockwaves through the community, as the Reyes family was well known and respected. The police quickly identified the pattern of the crime, recognizing it as the work of the Akayatbi Gang, whose previous robberies had all been carried out in similar fashion. The authorities were under immense pressure to track down the criminals and bring them to justice. However, the gang's careful planning and knowledge of the area made them difficult to catch. The police investigation into the kidnapping would prove to be a turning point in the gang's operations. The case also garnered widespread media attention, with newspapers and television stations following every development closely. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the Akayatbi Gang had been involved in a series of high-profile crimes over the past several years. Law enforcement agencies began to work together, pooling their resources to track down the gang and dismantle their operations. At the same time, the public grew increasingly fearful as news of the gang's exploits spread throughout the country. The fear surrounding the gang was compounded by their perceived invincibility. They were highly organized and well-funded, with an extensive network of informants and corrupt officials aiding them in their operations. In addition, the gang had several safe houses across the region, where they could hide out after carrying out a crime, making it even more challenging for authorities to locate them. As the authorities began to close in on the gang, Ramon and his members went into hiding, temporarily halting their criminal activities. However, the fear they had instilled in the community remained, and the media continued to cover the case extensively. What the public did not know was that the gang's activities were far from over. The tension surrounding the Akayatbi Gang reached a peak when the Reyes family's kidnapping took place in late 1992. The family of the wealthy businessman Alfonso Reyes had been taken from their home in the middle of the night, causing immediate alarm. The gang demanded a ransom of 10 million pesos, a staggering amount even for such a wealthy family, which indicated just how confident the criminals were in their power. Their instructions were simple. The family would only be released when the ransom was paid in full, with no room for negotiation. The Reyes family was locked away in a hidden location, Rumors suggested that it was one of the gang's safe houses in a remote part of Luzon. Despite their distress, the family was not harmed physically, a factor that led some to speculate that the criminals had a sense of professionalism, intending only to secure the ransom. However, the fear and anxiety that gripped the family during their captivity were unimaginable. As soon as the police were informed of the kidnapping, a special task force was assembled to track down the criminals. The police, already familiar with the Kayatbi gang, believed that their sophisticated operations could lead them to the culprits quickly. However, the gang's ability to hide their tracks, utilizing safe houses and a vast network of allies, made the investigation challenging. The authorities' first step was to gather intelligence from previous Kayatbi crimes. Several of the gang's victims had reported similar tactics and demands, but so far, the police had been unable to pinpoint the true identities of the gang members. Ramon, the gang leader, and his lieutenants were careful to use intermediaries to communicate with their victims and avoid direct involvement with the crime. This made it difficult for the police to get closer to the perpetrators. However, the task force had one advantage. They had gathered an informant within the criminal underworld who had been paying attention to the Akiatbahay gang's activities. This informant, who had once been a small-time associate of Ramon's gang, came forward with valuable details that led the investigators closer to the gang's operations. The informant's tip was critical. He disclosed the location of a safe house that the gang had used in the past, a secluded farmhouse on the outskirts of Manila. It was a place where the criminals could lie low for weeks without raising suspicion. With this information, the police launched a high-risk raid in the hopes of rescuing the Reyes family and capturing the kidnappers. The raid, however, ended in failure. The criminals had received word that the authorities were closing in, and they had already moved the Reyes family to another location. The police found the farmhouse abandoned, but they did uncover evidence of the gang's operations. Stolen goods, ransom notes, and other items that tied the location to their criminal activities. This discovery solidified the police's belief that the Kayatbi gang was behind the kidnapping, and that the criminals were highly organized with contingency plans in place for any potential raids. The failure of the raid was a significant setback for the authorities, but it also intensified their resolve to find the gang. The police expanded their investigation to include local informants, hoping to get a breakthrough that would lead to the release of the Reyes family. At the same time, the media coverage of the kidnapping intensified, with many people across the country following the case closely. In the weeks following the raid, Ramon and his gang became increasingly nervous. They had managed to evade capture for years, but with the police now focused entirely on them, the pressure was mounting. Rumors began to circulate that some members of the gang were beginning to question Ramon's leadership. As the situation grew more tense, the gang's operations began to unravel. Despite the immense pressure, Ramon remained determined. He knew that they had to maintain control over the situation or risk losing everything they had built. But cracks in the organization were beginning to show. The police were getting closer, and the fear of betrayal was growing within the gang. Some of the members began to doubt whether the large ransom they had demanded was worth the mounting risks. Others, however, were determined to carry through, driven by greed and the promise of unimaginable wealth. In the midst of this turmoil, the Reyes family was still being held captive. Their fate was uncertain, but as time passed, it became clear that the gang's grip on the situation was slowly slipping. The police were getting closer, and the sense of fear and paranoia within the gang grew stronger. The tension surrounding the Kayatbi gang reached a peak when the Reyes family's kidnapping took place in late 1992. The family of the wealthy businessman Alfonso Reyes had been taken from their home in the middle of the night, causing immediate alarm. The gang demanded a ransom of 10 million pesos, a staggering amount even for such a wealthy family, which indicated just how confident the criminals were in their power. Their instructions were simple. The family would only be released when the ransom was paid in full, with no room for negotiation. The Reyes family was locked away in a hidden location. Rumors suggested that it was one of the gang's safe houses in a remote part of Luzon. Despite their distress, the family was not harmed physically, a factor that led some to speculate that the criminals had a sense of professionalism, intending only to secure the ransom. However, the fear and anxiety that gripped the family during their captivity were unimaginable. As soon as the police were informed of the kidnapping, a special task force was assembled to track down the criminals. The police, already familiar with the Kayatbi gang, believed that their sophisticated operations could lead them to the culprits quickly. However, the gang's ability to hide their tracks, utilizing safe houses and a vast network of allies, made the investigation challenging. The authorities' first step was to gather intelligence from previous MR.NightCrime crimes. Several of the gang's victims had reported similar tactics and demands. But so far, the police had been unable to pinpoint the true identities of the gang members. Ramon, the gang leader, and his lieutenants were careful to use intermediaries to communicate with their victims and avoid direct involvement with the crimes. This made it difficult for the police to get closer to the perpetrators. However, the task force had one advantage. They had gathered an informant within the criminal underworld who had been paying attention to the MR.NightCrime gang's activities. This informant, who had once been a small-time associate of Ramon's gang, came forward with valuable details that led the investigators closer to the gang's operations. The informant's tip was critical. He disclosed the location of a safe house that the gang had used in the past, a secluded farmhouse on the outskirts of Manila. It was a place where the criminals could lie low for weeks without raising suspicion. With this information, the police launched a high-risk raid in the hopes of rescuing the Reyes family and capturing the kidnappers. The raid, however, ended in failure. The criminals had received word that the authorities were closing in, and they had already moved the Reyes family to another location. The police found the farmhouse abandoned, but they did uncover evidence of the gang's operations, stolen goods, ransom notes, and other items that tied the location to their criminal activities. This discovery solidified the police's belief that the MR.NightCrime gang was behind the kidnapping, and that the criminals were highly organized, with contingency plans in place for any potential raids. The failure of the raid was a significant setback for the authorities, but it also intensified their resolve to find the gang. The police expanded their investigation to include local informants, hoping to get a breakthrough that would lead to the release of the Reyes family. At the same time, the media coverage of the kidnapping intensified, with many people across the country following the case closely. In the weeks following the raid, Ramon and his gang became increasingly nervous. They had managed to evade capture for years, but with the police now focused entirely on them, the pressure was mounting. Rumors began to circulate that some members of the gang were beginning to question Ramon's leadership. As the situation grew more tense, the gang's operations began to unravel. Despite the immense pressure, Ramon remained determined. He knew that they had to maintain control over the situation or risk losing everything they had built. But cracks in the organization were beginning to show. The police were getting closer, and the fear of betrayal was growing within the gang. Some of the members began to doubt whether the large ransom they had demanded was worth the mounting risks. Others, however, were determined to carry through, driven by greed and the promise of unimaginable wealth. In the midst of this turmoil, the Reyes family was still being held captive. Their fate was uncertain, but as time passed, it became clear that the gang's grip on the situation was slowly slipping. The police were getting closer, and the sense of fear and paranoia within the gang grew stronger. The tension reached a breaking point when, in early 1993, the MR.NightCrime gang made a crucial mistake. One of the members, Mia, who had been operating as the gang's informant and recruiter, grew increasingly restless as the pressure from both the police and internal dissent began to take its toll. While she had been key to the gang's success, Mia had her own motivations. She had grown tired of the constant fear and wanted out of the criminal life. Mia made the decision to contact the authorities, offering them information in exchange for immunity. In a bold move, she disclosed the exact location of the Reyes family, who had been moved once again to a hideout in the mountainous region of northern Luzon. The police, armed with this new intelligence, devised a detailed plan to rescue the family and apprehend the criminals once and for all. The rescue operation was carefully coordinated. The police surrounded the area where the Reyes family was being held, making sure that they would have no chance of escaping. At the same time, other law enforcement teams moved in on key members of the gang's network, hoping to prevent any potential backup from coming to their aid. The authorities knew that time was running out. If they didn't act quickly, the gang would scatter and the chance of capturing them would be lost. At dawn, the police moved in on the hideout and the operation was carried out flawlessly. In a daring raid, the Reyes family was freed without injury, and several key members of the MR.NightCrime gang were arrested. However, Ramon and his most trusted associates managed to escape in the chaos. Despite this, the police had made significant progress in dismantling the gang's operations. The news of the rescue spread rapidly throughout the country, and the public reacted with a mix of relief and shock. The AKB gang, once seen as a virtually invincible criminal organization, had been severely weakened. The authorities had made substantial headway in their pursuit of justice, and the kidnapping case had become a symbol of the government's commitment to combating organized crime. Ramon, however, was not finished. His escape only fueled his determination to keep the gang's operations alive. The remaining members of the Akihapahi gang went into hiding, but their ability to operate effectively had been diminished. The police continued to close in on Ramon, and within months their persistence paid off. Ramon was eventually captured in a raid on a remote safe house, bringing an end to his reign of terror. His arrest marked a decisive moment in the downfall of the Akihapahi gang. In the aftermath, the Akihapahi gang's members were tried and convicted for their crimes, with many facing long sentences for their involvement in a series of violent activities, including the kidnapping of the Reyes family. While some of the lesser members cooperated with authorities and provided information that led to the conviction of their leaders, Ramon and Julius were sentenced to life in prison, while Mia, who had turned informant, was granted immunity and placed in witness protection. The rest of the gang members were either caught or killed in shootouts with the police, marking the complete dismantling of the Akihabara criminal enterprise. The Reyes family, though freed, struggled to recover from the trauma they had endured. The emotional scars of the kidnapping stayed with them for years, and their once peaceful life had been irrevocably changed. Alfonso Reyes, despite his wealth and success, was a changed man, and he began advocating for greater awareness of the dangers posed by organized crime in the country. His public efforts to shed light on the horrors of kidnapping and other violent crimes made him an influential figure in the fight against organized crime in the Philippines. For the people of Metro Manila and beyond, the capture of the Akiapa gang served as a reminder of how deeply organized crime could take root in even the wealthiest parts of society. The gang's activities had exposed vulnerabilities in the security systems of wealthy neighborhoods, and the case prompted an overhaul of law enforcement and security measures in high-profile areas. The government, in response to the public outcry, increased its focus on tackling organized crime, working with international law enforcement agencies to prevent similar incidents from occurring. The Akayat Bay case remained a pivotal moment in the Philippines' fight against organized crime in the 1990s. It underscored the power of law enforcement in working together and highlighted the importance of vigilance in maintaining public safety. While the gang's leaders were behind bars, the legacy of their crimes continued to shape the way the country approached crime prevention and law enforcement in the years that followed. The saga of the Akiapahey gang ultimately became a story of both terror and triumph, a terrifying example of how crime could infiltrate even the most secure environments, but also a testament to the resilience of the authorities and the victims in the face of unimaginable circumstances. Let's jump to next story. Story 2. In 1991, Southeast Asia was dealing with a surge in organized crime, and one of the most significant and terrifying cases that year involved a group of criminals who carried out a high-profile series of armed robberies and kidnapping in Malaysia. This group was led by a man known only as Abdul Rashid, a pseudonym, a former soldier who had turned to a life of crime after being dishonorably discharged from the army years earlier. Abdul Rashid's background in military tactics and his knowledge of weaponry made him a formidable criminal leader. His calm demeanor and strategic thinking allowed him to rise to prominence within the criminal underworld. Abdul Rashid was not alone in his activities. He was accompanied by a group of highly skilled individuals who were key to his operations. Among them was Shamsul, a former police officer who had become disillusioned with the law enforcement system. Shamsul was particularly valuable because of his knowledge of police protocols, which allowed him to avoid detection during the gang's operations. Another member of the group was Zulfikar, a technician with a deep understanding of security systems. Zulfikar's expertise allowed the gang to bypass alarm systems and surveillance cameras, making them nearly undetectable during their heists. The group, which would later come to be known as the Rashid Syndicate, focused on wealthy individuals and businesses, carefully selecting their targets based on their wealth and vulnerability. Their primary method of operation involved meticulously planned armed robberies, often followed by kidnappings. The goal was not just to steal valuable goods, but to secure ransom payments by holding individuals captive for short periods of time. The syndicate was well organized, with each member playing a crucial role in ensuring the success of their criminal activities. The syndicate's first major operation occurred in the early months of 1991. The target was a wealthy business tycoon, Tan Sri Abdullah, who owned several luxury car dealerships across Malaysia. Abdullah was known for his extravagant lifestyle, making him an attractive target for the Rashid syndicate. Abdul Rashid and his gang had been tracking Abdullah's movements for weeks, observing his daily routines and his security measures. They discovered that Abdullah had a habit of attending a weekly golf match at a private club located on the outskirts of Kuala Lumpur. This routine made him predictable, which was exactly what the gang needed. On the day of the robbery, the Rashid syndicate laid out a well-executed plan. At the golf course, Abdul Rashid and his associates, dressed as maintenance workers, managed to infiltrate the event without raising any suspicion. The gang had set up a series of distractions, ensuring that the security guards and club staff were occupied elsewhere. At the right moment, Abdul Rashid and his men ambushed Abdullah as he was leaving the club, dragging him into a waiting vehicle. The kidnapping was swift and precise, with no shots fired. Abdullah was held in a safe house on the outskirts of the city, and the gang immediately made their ransom demands. They contacted Abdullah's family, requesting a ransom of 5 million Malaysian ringgit in exchange for his safe return. The family was in shock but complied, agreeing to deliver the ransom. However, the gang's plan wasn't simply about the money. They had a deeper purpose. The kidnapping of Abdullah was only the beginning. The Rashid syndicate had much bigger ambitions, using the wealth they accumulated to fund even larger criminal operations. Their aim was not only to intimidate wealthy individuals, but also to send a message to the public. The syndicate had the power to strike at any time, anywhere. This was a new kind of terror that the people of Malaysia had not experienced before. The gang's ability to execute such a high-stakes operation without a single casualty was a testament to their professionalism and ruthlessness. As the police launched their investigation into the kidnapping, they quickly realized that they were dealing with a highly skilled and organized group of criminals. The fact that Abdul Rashid and his men had been able to execute the crime without leaving a trace made them a formidable adversary. The authorities had no leads to follow, and for a time, it seemed as though the Rashid syndicate would remain undetected. Despite their careful planning, however, the Rashid syndicate made a fatal mistake. The ransom exchange was the critical moment where the police managed to gain a small but important piece of information. The location of the ransom drop was in an area that, unbeknownst to the criminals, had been under surveillance by law enforcement. Police had set up hidden cameras and officers in plain clothes to monitor the drop and hopefully identify the culprits. This operation would mark the beginning of the unraveling of the Rashid syndicate. The ransom drop went smoothly on the surface, but the authorities had already placed trackers on the ransom bags. After receiving the money, the gang quickly fled the scene. But their escape was less smooth than they had anticipated. The trackers led the police to an abandoned warehouse in a quiet part of town, where the gang had planned to stash the ransom money and lay low for a while. His role as the mastermind behind the Rashid syndicate, Shamsul revealed that Abdul Rashid had been coordinating the operations remotely and had developed a network of safe houses across Malaysia to keep the gang hidden from law enforcement. Rashid's ability to stay out of sight while running a complex criminal organization was a testament to his skill in evading capture. Shamsul, though injured, became a crucial piece in the puzzle that was the Rashid syndicate. His information led the police to a series of hideouts where they found more stolen goods, including jewelry from the earlier kidnappings and armed robbery operations. Shamsul also disclosed the identity of the remaining gang members and the structure of their criminal network, which stretched from Kuala Lumpur to smaller towns in neighboring states. The authorities soon learned that Abdul Rashid was not just hiding in one location, but had been constantly moving between different safe houses. The gang leader's meticulous nature made him nearly impossible to track. However, Shamsul's cooperation allowed the police to map out the locations of these hideouts, giving them a clearer idea of where Abdul Rashid might be. As the police gathered this information, they realized the urgency of capturing Rashid. He was the heart of the syndicate, and without him, the gang would likely fall apart. The authorities quickly organized a special task force with officers from across the country, including elite counterterrorism units, to coordinate a nationwide manhunt. The raid on the warehouse had been a success, but the real challenge now was finding Abdul Rashid and the remaining members of the gang before they could disappear for good. The hunt was on. Meanwhile, Abdul Rashid, aware that his gang's hideout had been raided, went into hiding. He had grown paranoid. Knowing that the police were closing in, he continued to move from one safe house to another, carefully evading any traces of his whereabouts. Rashid also began to distance himself from his gang members, fearing that the police might use them to track him down. Despite his precautions, his extensive criminal network was beginning to unravel, and he could no longer rely on his previous methods of communication or secure locations. The task force deployed to capture Abdul Rashid was relentless. They followed every lead, no matter how small, hoping to get closer to him. However, the gang leader's experience and knowledge of the terrain made him a difficult target. It wasn't until late in the year, after several months of searching, that the police received a significant break. A former associate of Abdul Rashid, who had fallen out of favor with the gang leader, tipped off the authorities about a meeting that was set to take place at a secluded house in the mountains. The informant, desperate to cut ties with the Rashid syndicate, provided detailed directions to the police, who quickly set their plan into motion. The house was located in a remote area, far from the major cities where the authorities had been focusing their efforts. The location seemed carefully chosen, possibly to avoid detection by both law enforcement and the criminal underworld. The police acted swiftly, deploying helicopters and ground units to seal off all access points to the area. By the time Abdul Rashid and his remaining associates arrived at the house, it was too late. At dawn, the police surrounded the house. Abdul Rashid and his gang members, realizing that they had been trapped, attempted to flee. A tense standoff ensued, with Rashid and his associates attempting to break through the police barricade. However, the officers had anticipated this move and were prepared for the confrontation. After several hours of negotiation, during which Abdul Rashid attempted to bargain for his freedom, the police launched a final offensive. In the ensuing exchange of gunfire, Abdul Rashid was captured. His capture marked the end of the Rashid syndicate's reign of terror. His arrest was the result of months of tireless investigation and strategic planning by law enforcement. For the first time in months, the authorities could breathe a sigh of relief, knowing that the man who had orchestrated numerous high-profile crimes was finally behind bars. The capture of Abdul Rashid marked the end of one of the most dangerous and well-organized criminal syndicates in Malaysia. However, the road to justice was far from over. With Rashid in custody, the police turned their attention to bringing him to trial, hoping to put an end to his criminal empire once and for all. The authorities knew that the trial would be a significant moment for the nation, not just because of the crimes Abdul Rashid had committed, but because it represented a larger victory against organized crime in Southeast Asia. Rashid was charged with a wide range of offenses, including multiple kidnappings, armed robberies, the unlawful possession of firearms, and conspiracy to commit murder. His syndicate's criminal activities had caused widespread fear and disruption, and the victims of their crimes were eager to see justice served. The public's interest in the case was immense, with many citizens following the proceedings closely. Rashid's trial became a symbol of the government's commitment to cracking down on organized crime. During the trial, Abdul Rashid's defense team attempted to paint him as a victim of circumstance, someone who had been abandoned by society and driven to a life of crime due to his poor upbringing and experiences in the military. However, the prosecution presented a much stronger case, showing the calculated and premeditated nature of Rashid's crimes. They detailed how Rashid had planned and executed multiple kidnappings and robberies, not just for financial gain, but to establish power and control over the wealthy elite of Malaysia. His manipulation of his gang members and use of fear to maintain his authority within the Rashid syndicate was key to demonstrating his role as the mastermind behind the criminal operations. The prosecution also presented evidence gathered during the police raids, including testimony from Shamsul, who had turned state witness after his capture. Shamsul's testimony was critical in connecting Rashid to the various crimes, as he provided insight into the inner workings of the Rashid syndicate, and the lengths the gang had gone to remain undetected by the authorities. The documents found in the warehouse, which detailed future heists and kidnappings, were also crucial pieces of evidence. Despite his earlier attempts to deny his involvement, Abdul Rashid's defense began to weaken as the evidence piled up. His own gang members, including Shamsul, testified against him, explaining how he had orchestrated the operations from behind the scenes and how his leadership had instilled fear among those who worked for him. After months of deliberations, the court found Abdul Rashid guilty on multiple counts, including kidnapping, armed robbery, and racketeering. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. His conviction marked the end of a dark chapter in Malaysia's history, as the Rashid Syndicate had terrorized the country for almost 2 years. Rashid's capture and subsequent trial sent a strong message to other criminal organizations operating in the region. Law enforcement was determined to bring down those who threatened the safety and security of the nation. While Abdul Rashid was imprisoned, the aftermath of his crimes continued to affect the victims, especially those who had been kidnapped. For many of them, the trauma of being held captive by the Rashid Syndicate was something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Several of the victims spoke out publicly, sharing their experiences and describing the fear and emotional toll the kidnappings had taken on them and their families. As for the Rashid Syndicate, its disbandment left a significant void in the criminal underworld of Southeast Asia. Several of the gang's members were arrested and sentenced to long prison terms, while others, like Zulfikar, managed to escape capture for a time. However, their ability to operate as effectively as they once had was gone. The police's dismantling of the syndicate served as a major victory for law enforcement, but they also recognized that the fight against organized crime was far from over. New criminal organizations would undoubtedly rise in their place, but the Rashid Syndicate case served as a blueprint for how law enforcement could unite and take down complex criminal networks. In the years that followed, Malaysia's government and police force used the lessons learned from the Rashid Syndicate case to improve their strategies for combating organized crime. There were increased efforts to tackle corruption within the police force and to improve the coordination between various law enforcement agencies across Southeast Asia. The case also prompted a closer look at the root causes of organized crime, with greater emphasis placed on social issues such as poverty, lack of opportunity, and corruption that often pushed individuals toward criminal activities. The story of Abdul Rashid and his syndicate, while ending in his conviction, left a lasting legacy in Malaysia's fight against organized crime. It became a turning point in how law enforcement agencies in Southeast Asia approached the issue, with a greater focus on intelligence gathering, cross-border cooperation, and public awareness. Though Abdul Rashid spent the remainder of his life behind bars, the scars left by his criminal empire would be felt for years to come. For the people of Malaysia, his arrest and trial were a bittersweet reminder of the dangers of unchecked criminal power, and a hopeful symbol of the country's commitment to ensuring that justice would prevail. Let's jump to next story. Story 3. In 1993, Southeast Asia was grappling with increasing instances of organized crime, with one of the most infamous and shocking cases of that year originating in Thailand. This case involved a sophisticated kidnapping ring led by a former military officer named Somchai Fetman. Somchai, in his early 40s at the time, had been discharged from the Thai army for misconduct, including corruption and involvement in illicit activities. However, instead of returning to civilian life, he used his knowledge of military tactics and his connections within Thailand's underworld to form a powerful criminal network. Sankai's syndicate specialized in high-profile kidnappings, targeting wealthy business people and their families. What set Sankai's group apart from other criminal organizations was their methodical approach and military-like precision. His past experience in the army enabled him to orchestrate kidnappings that were not only well-planned, but often carried out without a trace. Somchai became a notorious figure, known for his ruthless tactics and his ability to evade the police for years. He had surrounded himself with a team of former soldiers, mercenaries, and even ex-law enforcement officers who were just as skilled in combat and strategy as he was. Among his closest associates were Art Hit, a former police detective who had turned to crime after being dismissed from his position due to corruption, and Nadawat, a tech expert who could disable security systems and surveillance cameras with ease. Together, they formed the core of the syndicate that terrorized affluent families across Thailand, often demanding massive ransoms in exchange for the safe release of their victims. Their first major operation in 1993 involved the kidnapping of Vanan Chayasak, a prominent businessman who owns several luxury hotels and resorts in Thailand. Vanan, in his mid-50s, was well known within the business community, and his abduction would serve as the gang's statement of power and their ability to strike at the heart of the country's elite. Vanan was targeted because he was seen as a soft target, someone with deep pockets who would be able to meet the gang's demands. Somchai and his team meticulously planned the kidnapping. They had done their homework on Vanan's daily routines, learning when he would be most vulnerable. Vanan, like many businessmen of his stature, had a routine of meeting associates and conducting business in high-end restaurants and cafes. On the evening of the abduction, Van An had attended a meeting at one of his favorite spots in Bangkok. The kidnapping was carried out with military precision. The syndicate had been watching Van An for days, knowing exactly when and where he would be. As Van An exited the restaurant around 8 p.m., he was ambushed by a group of masked men, who quickly restrained him and forced him into a waiting vehicle. The operation was swift, and there were no witnesses who could identify the perpetrators. The police were left with very little evidence, except for a few dropped pieces of clothing and a discarded gun that was later found near the scene. Within hours, Sankai's team contacted Van An's family, demanding a ransom of 50 million Thai baht for his safe return. The message was clear: pay the money, or they would never see Van An again. The family, although in shock, knew they had little choice but to comply. Van An's wife, Serwin, immediately contacted the authorities, but the gang had made it clear that any involvement of the police would lead to Van An's death. The police, while unable to act directly, had been monitoring the situation closely. They knew that the Somchai syndicate had been active for some time, and this kidnapping appeared to be part of a larger pattern of crimes that had been escalating in Thailand over the past few months. However, despite their knowledge of the syndicate's existence, they had yet to gather sufficient evidence to link Somchai directly to the criminal operations. As the hours passed, the tension built. Van An's family was forced to negotiate with Somchai's group, trying to buy time while the police worked behind the scenes to gather intelligence. The authorities knew that a ransom drop could provide an opportunity to catch the criminals in the act, but they had to be cautious. Somchai and his gang were skilled in evasion and would not hesitate to eliminate anyone who got in their way. Meanwhile, Donan was being held captive in a safe house on the outskirts of Bangkok, a location that had been chosen for its remote nature, far from the prying eyes of the city. The safe house was heavily fortified with armed guards, and Somchai had taken extra precautions to ensure that there was no way for the police to trace the location. Van An, who had been blindfolded and bound, was kept in a small room with little food or water, a tactic designed to weaken him physically and mentally. Despite the grueling conditions, Van An remained calm, relying on his resolve and his faith to keep him strong in the face of the terrifying ordeal. Somchai, always the strategist, had planned for every possible scenario. He knew that the authorities would try to track the ransom money once it was delivered, so he had devised a series of decoy routes and false drops in order to confuse the police. This was not just a simple extortion scheme. This was a test of his ability to outwit law enforcement and to demonstrate his gang's dominance over the Thai police. As the days passed, the police made progress in their investigation, slowly piecing together information from witnesses and surveillance footage around the city. A break came when one of the gang's associates, a low-level member who had been involved in the surveillance operation, was caught attempting to flee the country. Under questioning, the associate provided vital details about the safe house and the gang's operations. The police now had a lead. Somchai and his men were not as untouchable as they had thought. With the new information provided by the gang member who had been caught trying to flee, the investigation into Somchai's syndicate began to accelerate. The police now had a solid lead: the location of the safe house where the non was being held captive. However, there was still a significant risk involved. The Somchai syndicate was known for its ability to disappear quickly, and the safe house was well hidden in a remote area of Bangkok. The police needed to act fast, but carefully to avoid alerting the criminals and risking Van An's life. The authorities began gathering their best units for a well-coordinated raid. They knew that timing was critical, and a single mistake could result in a hostage situation that would end tragically. The team included elite officers from Thailand Special Forces, the Rangers, who were trained to handle high-risk operations. Their primary objective was to rescue Van An unharmed, and they were prepared to use any means necessary to ensure his safety. The police also intensified their surveillance of the gang, tracking their movements and monitoring communication channels that might lead them to Somchai. Through wiretaps and intercepted messages, they discovered that Somchai was constantly moving between safe houses to avoid detection. It was evident that he had become paranoid, which meant he was growing increasingly erratic and unstable. A breakthrough came when the police learned that Somchai was planning to meet with his gang members to discuss the ransom exchange. Using this information, the police set up a sting operation preparing to intercept the exchange and finally capture Somchai and his team. On the night of the planned exchange, the authorities had every escape route covered. Armed police officers were strategically placed along the main roads leading to the drop-off point, and undercover officers were already positioned to monitor the movements of the gang. In the event of a standoff, the police were prepared to act swiftly and decisively. Meanwhile, at the safe house, Van N had endured days of isolation. He was growing weaker, not only physically from lack of food and water, but mentally as well. His family had been in constant contact with the police, desperately trying to meet the kidnappers' demands while hoping for his safe return. Van N's wife, Serwin, had been emotionally drained but remained strong throughout the ordeal. The thought that her husband was still alive and might be rescued kept her going. She also feared that the longer the negotiations dragged on, the higher the chances were that the criminals might become more desperate and violent. As the ransom drop approached, the tension reached its peak. The criminals, unaware that they were being closely watched, made their way to the predetermined location. They had set up their own plan for the drop. The money was to be left in an unmarked bag at a secluded spot near a busy market in Bangkok. The exchange was supposed to take place at midnight, when the area would be relatively empty. Just before the exchange took place, police units were in position, ready to move in. The clock struck midnight, and gang arrived, seemingly unaware of the police's presence. Sam Chai, who had kept his identity hidden during the whole process, was not physically present at the exchange, but his trusted associate Arthit was in charge of overseeing the drop. As Arthit and two other gang members made the exchange, they were immediately surrounded by the police. In a matter of seconds, the quiet streets turned chaotic. The police quickly moved in, shouting orders for the criminals to surrender. Arthit, realizing he was trapped, attempted to flee, but his escape was short-lived. He was captured in a matter of moments, along with the other two gang members. The entire exchange was over in less than 10 minutes. However, Samchai was not with them. The mastermind had anticipated the possibility of a police ambush, so he had stayed behind, observing the operation from a distance. Realizing that his men were compromised, he began to make plans for his own escape. The police had seized the ransom money, but they knew that Samchai's capture was the key to ending the syndicate once and for all. The pressure was now on the authorities to track down the leader. They had his associates in custody, but the mastermind was still elusive. It was clear that Samchai had been careful in covering his tracks, and the police would have to employ every resource at their disposal to find him. In the days following the ransom exchange, the investigation intensified. The authorities interrogated the captured gang members, including Arthit, who was initially resistant to talk. However, the pressure eventually caused cracks in his resolve. Arthit, realizing that he was facing a lengthy prison sentence, began to provide vital information about Samchai's hideouts and his network of associates. Arthit led the police to a series of safe houses where Samchai had been hiding, but by the time the police arrived, the leader had already fled. It was clear that Samchai had grown increasingly cautious, and he was no longer operating from one central location. Despite the setback, the police were now confident that they were closing in on him. The case was now being treated as a priority, and law enforcement officials were beginning to realize that Samchai's syndicate had been operating across a broader network than previously thought. The more they uncovered about the gang's operations, the more they understood just how far-reaching their activities had been. Samchai's syndicate had been involved in multiple kidnappings, extortions, and illicit activities across Thailand, and their reach extended into neighboring countries. The hunt for Samchai became a nationwide operation. The police were relentless, determined to bring down the syndicate once and for all. As weeks passed, their efforts began to pay off. The weeks following the ransom exchange were tense, as the authorities meticulously pieced together every scrap of information they had gathered. The police had intensified their search for Samchai, with no stone left unturned. The police network expanded across Thailand, utilizing the help of neighboring countries, especially Cambodia and Laos, which were often used as escape routes for criminals attempting to evade Thai law enforcement. The net was closing in on Samchai, and he could feel the pressure mounting. In early August 1993, a breakthrough came when one of Samchai's former associates, a man who had been arrested during the ransom drop operation, provided critical information. This associate, Phai Chai, revealed that Samchai had been hiding in a small village near the border of Thailand and Cambodia, a location that was relatively obscure and difficult to access. Phai Chai also mentioned that Samchai had grown increasingly paranoid and had been seen making plans to cross into Cambodia, where he had some connections. The authorities moved quickly. The special forces, along with local law enforcement, coordinated a large-scale operation to capture Samchai before he could escape across the border. It was a dangerous mission, as Samchai was known to be armed and had been trained in military tactics. He was also rumored to have recruited several locals to assist in his escape, making the search even more complicated. The operation was meticulously planned, with the police sending in undercover officers to infiltrate the village. They worked to identify Samchai's possible hideouts while maintaining surveillance to ensure that he did not slip away. The authorities also set up roadblocks at key locations leading out of the village and to the Cambodian border, hoping to catch him if he attempted to flee. The net had finally closed, and the pressure was mounting on Samchai. By mid-August, the operation reached its critical point. The police had successfully tracked Samchai to a small hut located on the outskirts of the village. The hut was surrounded by dense foliage, which had helped conceal Samchai's movements. At dawn on August 17, 1993, the police launched a surprise raid on the hut. As they moved in, they found Samchai inside, armed and prepared to resist. A brief standoff ensued, during which Samchai tried to fight back, firing at the officers. However, the police were well prepared and swiftly subdued Samchai. He was captured without any further violence, and he was immediately taken into custody. The authorities had finally apprehended the man who had orchestrated so many kidnappings and extortions across Thailand. His capture was a monumental success for law enforcement, bringing a long-awaited sense of justice to the victims and their families. Samchai's arrest was widely covered in the media, and it sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld in Thailand. His syndicate had terrorized the nation for months, and his fall marked the end of one of the most dangerous criminal operations in the country's history. The authorities hailed the operation as a success, with police officials praising the strategic planning and execution of the mission. Following his capture, Samchai was quickly brought to trial. The case was highly publicized, with the government determined to send a strong message that organized crime would not be tolerated. Samchai was charged with numerous crimes, including multiple kidnappings, extortion, illegal possession of firearms, and operating a criminal syndicate. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His capture, combined with testimony from his former associates, painted a clear picture of his leadership within the Samchai syndicate. At his trial, Samchai remained defiant, attempting to claim that he had been coerced into a life of crime due to his military background and the corrupt practices he had witnessed. However, the evidence against him was undeniable. The prosecution called upon the victims of his crimes, many of whom gave emotional testimonies about the trauma they had experienced during their kidnapping. Vanan Chayasak, the businessman whose abduction had sparked the investigation, was one of the key witnesses. Vanan spoke about the fear he had felt during his captivity, and how his family had been torn apart during the ordeal. In September 1993, after weeks of deliberation, the court found Samchai guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. His sentence was seen as a significant victory for law enforcement in Thailand, signaling a major crackdown on organized crime in the country. The aftermath of Samchai's capture had a profound impact on both the criminal landscape and the public's perception of safety in Thailand. Many smaller gangs and criminal groups operating in the country realized that their days of operating with impunity were numbered. Law enforcement agencies across Southeast Asia began to collaborate more closely, sharing intelligence and working together to dismantle international criminal networks. Samchai's arrest also led to a broader investigation into the syndicates, financial operations, revealing a complex web of money laundering, bribery, and illegal businesses. Several of his associates were arrested and convicted, and their assets were seized. It was clear that the Samchai syndicate had been a highly organized and sophisticated operation, but with Samchai's conviction, it was effectively dismantled. For the victims, the end of the Samchai syndicate brought some sense of closure, though the scars left by their traumatic experiences would not fade easily. Vanan Chayasak and others who had been abducted by the gang continued to receive counseling and support, and many of them became vocal advocates for stronger measures against organized crime. They wanted to ensure that future generations of business leaders would not have to face the same kind of terror. Samchai spent the rest of his life in prison, a far cry from the powerful criminal mastermind he had once been. He remained silent during his incarceration, offering no further details about the workings of his criminal empire. However, his legacy lived on in the fear and devastation he had left in his wake. His capture and conviction, however, became a pivotal moment in Southeast Asia's fight against organized crime, and his downfall showed that even the most powerful criminals could be brought to justice. Let's jump to next story. Story 4. In 1994, Southeast Asia was facing an alarming rise in criminal activity, and one case that shocked the region involved the infamous Southeast Asia drug syndicate, led by a man named Abdul Rahman, also known as the Serpent. Abdul Rahman was a Malaysian national in his early 40s at the time, whose criminal network had deep roots in the global drug trade. His syndicate had been operating across various countries in Southeast Asia, including Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia. He was notorious for his calculated and ruthless approach to the production and trafficking of illegal drugs, primarily methamphetamine and heroin. Abdul Rahman's rise in the criminal underworld was not accidental. He had spent much of his early life involved in small-time crimes, primarily petty theft and drug-related offenses. However, his entry into the drug trade came when he was recruited by a larger criminal organization operating out of Hong Kong. He learned the intricacies of drug manufacturing and trafficking, eventually rising through the ranks to assume leadership of his own network. Abdul Rahman's ability to stay under the radar of law enforcement and his adeptness in managing a large-scale operation were key to his success. In running one of the most influential drug syndicates in Southeast Asia, his network was vast, involving multiple layers of individuals responsible for different aspects of the operation. At the core of Abdul Rahman's syndicate were several trusted lieutenants, each in charge of a specific task. There was Zakir, his right-hand man, responsible for overseeing the production of methamphetamine in secret labs. Farid, a former military officer who acted as the enforcer for the group, ensuring that no one betrayed the syndicate or crossed Abdul Rahman. And Siti, a logistics mastermind who managed the complex distribution system, ensuring the drugs were smuggled across borders without detection. The operations were spread across multiple countries, using a network of safe houses, trucks, and fishing boats to transport the drugs. The methamphetamine production took place in clandestine laboratories hidden in the jungles of Malaysia, far away from the prying eyes of law enforcement. Abdul Rahman's syndicate was highly secretive, and members were instructed to never meet in person unless absolutely necessary. This decentralized structure allowed the organization to remain operational even if some members were arrested, as the remaining members could continue their work without interruption. In 1994, Abdul Rahman's syndicate reached its peak, with large shipments of methamphetamine and heroin making their way through Thailand and Indonesia to international markets, including Australia, Japan, and even parts of Europe. The drugs were often disguised as legitimate goods, such as textiles or agricultural products, making it extremely difficult for authorities to detect the illicit shipments. Abdul Rahman's ability to bribe local officials and use corrupted networks further facilitated his syndicate's operations. He had cultivated relationships with politicians and law enforcement officers in various countries, ensuring that the police either turned a blind eye or actively assisted in moving the drugs. The operation came to a head in mid-1994, when an undercover operation by the Malaysian Narcotics Police, MNP, finally began to close in on Abdul Rahman and his associates. The breakthrough came when a small-time drug courier, who had been apprehended during a routine traffic stop, provided crucial information about a large drug shipment being organized by the syndicate. This individual, a man named Abu, was a low-level courier who had been used by Abdul Rahman's group to transport drugs across the border between Malaysia and Thailand. Abu had been arrested when police found a small amount of methamphetamine in his possession. Under intense interrogation, Abu broke down and began to reveal the details of his involvement with Abdul Rahman's organization. He explained how he had been tasked with picking up a large shipment of methamphetamine that was to be transported from Malaysia into Thailand, destined for the international market. Abu also provided information about the people involved in the operation, including Zakir and Farid, the two key lieutenants in the syndicate. Using Abu's testimony, the MNP began tracking the movement of the drugs and gathering intelligence on the individuals involved in the operation. The authorities quickly identified a small fishing village along the coast of Malaysia where Abdul Rahman's syndicate had been operating. This village served as one of the main points of entry and exit for the drugs, and it became the focal point of the police investigation. The Malaysian authorities, working with their counterparts in Thailand and Indonesia, launched a coordinated effort to dismantle the operation. This included wiretaps on known associates of the syndicate, surveillance of key locations, and gathering evidence on the movement of illicit goods. The Malaysian police also enlisted the help of the Royal Thai Police and Indonesian National Police, forming a regional task force to track the drug shipments and apprehend the leaders of the syndicate. The authorities also discovered that Abdul Rahman had been planning to send a particularly large shipment of methamphetamine from Malaysia to Thailand, which was set to take place in July 1994. The shipment was to be disguised as cargo on a fishing boat, and it would be smuggled through the Straits of Malacca, a narrow body of water between Malaysia and Indonesia. This would be one of the largest shipments of drugs the syndicate had ever attempted, and the police knew that they had to act quickly to prevent it. In early July 1994, as the authorities closed in on Abdul Rahman's operation, they received information that the drug shipment had already left Malaysia's shores and was on its way to Thailand. The police now had a limited window of time to intercept the shipment before it reached its destination. The stakes were high and the pressure was mounting. Abdul Rahman's rise to power began in the late 1980s when he capitalized on Southeast Asia's porous borders and weak law enforcement mechanisms. With a keen understanding of the drug trade's logistics, he established clandestine laboratories in the remote jungles of Thailand and Indonesia, ensuring that his operations remained largely undetected. His syndicate worked closely with corrupt officials, allowing him to move massive shipments of narcotics without interference. What set Abdul Rahman apart from other drug lords was his strategic approach to maintaining power. Unlike many crime bosses who relied solely on violence, he combined brutality with intelligence. He recruited chemists to refine the purity of his products, ensuring they were more potent and addictive. Additionally, he utilized an extensive network of traffickers, couriers, and enforcers, many of whom had been lured into the trade by promises of wealth and protection. Abdul Rahman earned his moniker, the Serpent, due to his ability to slither out of the grasp of law enforcement time and again. Authorities suspected him of orchestrating several high-profile assassinations of rival drug lords and informants who threatened his operations. Witnesses and potential whistleblowers often vanished without a trace, leading to widespread fear within the criminal underworld. His operations expanded rapidly, with shipments reaching not only local markets, but also international drug routes leading to Australia, Europe, and North America. As the syndicate grew, so did the violence associated with its activities. In 1993, a brutal massacre in a Bangkok warehouse brought international attention to Abdul Rahman's operation. A group of rival traffickers had attempted to intercept one of his heroin shipments, only to be met with deadly retaliation. When authorities arrived at the scene, they discovered the bodies of more than a dozen men, all executed in cold blood. This act of violence sent a clear message: crossing the serpent had fatal consequences. By the mid-1990s, authorities across Southeast Asia had begun prioritizing the dismantling of Abdul Rahman's empire. A joint task force comprising police from Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia, along with support from international agencies such as the DEA, was formed to track him down. Undercover operations, wiretaps, and informants were all deployed to infiltrate his network. Despite his ability to evade capture, a critical breakthrough occurred in late 1994 when authorities intercepted a large methamphetamine shipment off the coast of Sumatra. The arrested couriers provided key information that linked the drugs directly to Abdul Rahman's organization. This led to a series of coordinated raids on his facilities, dismantling several of his drug laboratories and seizing millions of dollars worth of narcotics. The final blow came in December 1994, when intelligence led authorities to a secluded villa in Bali, where Abdul Rahman had been hiding under a false identity. A carefully executed raid resulted in his arrest after a brief but intense standoff. He was extradited to Malaysia, where he faced multiple charges, including drug trafficking, money laundering, and murder. During his trial, former associates turned against him, revealing the extent of his empire's crimes. Despite his attempts to manipulate the legal system, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. His execution in 1996 marked the end of one of Southeast Asia's most feared criminal enterprises. Although Abdul Rahman's arrest and execution crippled his organization, remnants of his network persisted. Some of his former lieutenants attempted to rebuild the syndicate, but without the serpent at the helm, they lacked the strategic cunning that had made the empire so formidable. Law enforcement continued to pursue these remnants, gradually eradicating what was left of his once mighty cartel. The case of Abdul Rahman serves as a chilling reminder of how the drug trade can devastate societies and how criminal masterminds can rise to power through a combination of fear, corruption, and strategic acumen. However, it also highlights the relentless efforts of law enforcement agencies in their pursuit of justice. The fall of the serpent remains one of the most significant victories in Southeast Asia's fight against organized crime. Let's jump to next story. Story 5. In 1994, Southeast Asia was marked by various social and political developments that shaped the region's history. Among these, one particular criminal case stood out, the murder of the prominent businessman Tanan Kiat, which took place in Malaysia. This case captured the attention of the public due to the brutality of the crime, the complexity of the investigation, and the eventual conviction that shocked many. Tanan Kiat was a wealthy and influential businessman who had made a name for himself in the construction and property sectors. His success in the business world, however, came with its own set of challenges, including numerous enemies and rivals. Tan was known for his high-profile dealings and his involvement in several controversial projects, many of which were associated with land acquisitions and development contracts that stirred local communities. In the early hours of June 15, 1994, Tanan Kiat was found brutally murdered in his lavish home in the heart of Kuala Lumpur. His body was discovered by his housekeeper, who immediately alerted the authorities. Police arrived at the scene to find Tan lying lifeless on the floor of his study. He had been shot multiple times in the chest and head, and there were signs of a struggle. The crime scene suggested that the murderer had a personal motive, as there were no signs of forced entry, indicating that the killer was likely someone Tan knew. The case became a high-profile investigation, with the police initially focusing on Tan's business dealings. Given his status and the number of people involved in his various projects, investigators quickly suspected that the murder could be linked to a business dispute. However, despite several leads and interviews with business associates, no concrete evidence pointed to a clear suspect. It was clear that Tan had made many enemies over the years, and the murder could have been the result of one of these long-standing grievances. As the investigation progressed, the authorities began to focus on Tan's personal life. It was revealed that Tan had been involved in a complicated relationship with his secretary, who had been working with him for several years. This secretary, a woman in her late 20s, was described as ambitious and fiercely loyal to her boss. However, the police discovered that Tan had recently become distant and had started making arrangements to end their professional relationship, which could have caused resentment. The secretary became a prime suspect, but there was a lack of direct evidence connecting her to the crime. Authorities then shifted their focus to the security of Tan's household, which was well equipped with surveillance cameras and alarm systems. However, upon further inspection, they discovered that the cameras had been disabled the night of the murder, making the investigation more complicated. This raised suspicions that someone with inside knowledge of the household's security system was involved. Months passed, and the investigation into Tan's murder seemed to stall. Authorities were under pressure from the public to resolve the case, but there was no breakthrough in the case, and it seemed as if the killer would escape justice. The media heavily covered the story, with reports of Tan's wealth, influence, and mysterious personal life. The case became the subject of intense speculation, with theories ranging from business rivals to personal vendettas. In December of that year, however, a breakthrough came when a local informant provided new information to the police. This informant revealed that Tan's former business partner, who had once been involved in a failed development project with Tan, had been seen near his home on the night of the murder. The business partner, who had fallen into financial ruin after the project's failure, was known to have held a deep grudge against Tan for severing their professional relationship. This new lead reignited the investigation, and detectives were able to track down the business partner, who had been attempting to flee the country. After being apprehended, the business partner confessed to the crime, revealing a shocking motive behind the murder. He explained that his financial situation had deteriorated due to Tan's refusal to assist him in securing new business opportunities. In a fit of anger and desperation, the business partner planned and executed the murder, targeting Tan in a way that would make it appear as if the killing was the result of a personal dispute or a business-related conflict. The arrest of the business partner brought closure to the case, but it also raised many questions about the role of wealth and power in Southeast Asia during the 1990s. The murder of Tan and Kiat highlighted the dangerous and often cutthroat nature of the business world in the region. where individuals were willing to go to extreme lengths to protect their interests and wealth. The trial of Tan's killer was swift, with the business partner ultimately convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, and the case was closed. But the broader implications of the crime continued to resonate within Malaysia's business community. The murder of Tan and Kite served as a reminder of the complexities of business relations, the fragile nature of trust, and the potential for violence that can arise from greed and ambition. The murder of Tan and Kite not only shocked Malaysia, but also became a stark reminder of the darker side of business and power in Southeast Asia. As the case unfolded, it shed light on the deeply ingrained culture of rivalry and corruption that often permeated business dealings in the region. The killing itself was not an isolated event, but rather a reflection of the intense pressure many individuals faced as they navigated the complex world of business and high-stakes investments. In the wake of Tan's murder, discussions surrounding the case centered on the competitive environment that existed among wealthy businessmen in Southeast Asia during the 1990s. Economic growth in the region was at its peak, fueled by rapid urbanization, foreign investment, and an increasing demand for infrastructure and development. This period of prosperity was characterized by a booming real estate market and a thriving construction industry, where individuals like Tan and Kite were at the forefront. However, the fast-paced nature of the industry created a cutthroat atmosphere, with many companies vying for lucrative contracts and land deals. It was in this environment that Tan's unfortunate fate unfolded. Tan was not only a successful businessman, but also a key figure in several high-profile projects that involved land acquisitions, government contracts, and urban development. His influence was far-reaching, and with such power came inevitable conflict. One of the reasons that the case took so long to resolve was the sheer number of people who could have had a motive to harm him. His dealings in the property sector often put him at odds with local communities, government officials, and even other wealthy developers who saw him as a direct threat to their own ambitions. Furthermore, the 1990s were a period of significant economic and political changes in Malaysia. While the country was experiencing rapid development and modernization, there were growing concerns about corruption and inequality. The role of business elites in shaping policies, securing government deals, and consolidating power was often opaque, leading to public suspicion about the true nature of their success. Many believed that figures like Tan had risen to the top not only through hard work and innovation, but also by leveraging their connections and influencing political outcomes to their advantage. This created an atmosphere where public trust in the business community was fragile, and when tragedy like Tan's murder occurred, it felt like a manifestation of the deeper issues at play. The role of Tan's former business partner in the crime further highlighted the precarious nature of these business relationships. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the motivations for the murder were driven by personal resentment, financial ruin, and the pressure of maintaining one's the business partner had faced financial collapse after a project in which both he and Tan were heavily invested fell apart. The partner, unable to recover from the setback, blamed Tan for the failure and for cutting him out of future deals. In his mind, the murder became the only way to regain his position in the competitive landscape of business, where reputation and wealth were everything. The trial, which followed the arrest of the business partner, was widely covered by the media and became a topic of national conversation. The public was both horrified by the brutality of the crime and captivated by the drama of the courtroom. The defense team attempted to portray the business partner as a victim of his circumstances, arguing that his actions were a result of financial desperation. However, the prosecution countered that the murder was premeditated, highlighting the calculated nature of the crime and the lengths to which the business partner had gone to conceal his track. They pointed to the way he had disabled the security system and attempted to stage the crime scene to mislead investigators. In the end, the jury convicted the business partner of first-degree murder. The conviction sent shockwaves through the business community as it highlighted how greed, jealousy, and the hunger for power could drive individuals to extreme measures. The case also raised questions about the ethical implications of Malaysia's business culture during that period. Many began to wonder whether the immense wealth and power concentrated in the hands of a few individuals could breed corruption, distrust, and violence. It sparked broader discussions on how the country's economic system and political landscape needed to evolve to ensure a more transparent and fair business environment. Beyond the legal proceedings, Tan Kiat's death had a lasting impact on the Malaysian public. His murder served as a cautionary tale, reminding individuals of the dark side of ambition and the lengths to which some would go to secure their place in a highly competitive market. It also exposed the potential dangers of unchecked wealth and influence, as well as the vulnerability of individuals who found themselves caught in the crossfire of business rivalries. The case became part of a larger conversation about the challenges facing Southeast Asia's rapidly growing economies during the 1990s. Countries across the region were grappling with the same issues: the rapid rise of a wealthy elite, the spread of corruption, and the growing divide between the rich and poor. The story of Tan and Kite's murder and the subsequent trial were viewed as emblematic of the larger structural issues at play in Southeast Asia, where economic progress often came at the expense of transparency and accountability. By the time the business partner was sentenced to life imprisonment, the case had become an indelible part of Southeast Asia's criminal history. It was a tragic reminder of how the pursuit of wealth and success could sometimes result in unimaginable violence, and it forced many to re-examine the values that drove the region's booming economies. While the personal loss of Tan's life could never be undone, the case left a legacy that would continue to shape discussions on corruption, business ethics, and the consequences of unchecked ambition in the years that followed. Let's jump to next story. Story 6. In 1996, Southeast Asia was experiencing a period of significant change. Many countries in the region were benefiting from rapid economic growth, political shifts, and increased globalization. However, this growth came with its own set of challenges, including rising inequality, corruption, and violence. Among the most shocking criminal cases in the region during that time was the murder of a well-known journalist, Siti Hawa, in Indonesia, which captured national and international attention. Siti Hawa was a respected investigative journalist who worked for one of the largest newspapers in Jakarta. She was known for her bold reporting on corruption, human rights abuses, and social inequality. Her articles often exposed the dark side of Indonesia's political and corporate elite, which made her both highly admired and, for some, highly dangerous. Siti had made a name for herself by covering controversial topics that many other journalists avoided, such as government corruption, illegal logging, and human trafficking. Her work made her a target for powerful figures who wanted to silence her voice. Siti's death on the night of April 12, 1996, sent shockwaves throughout the country. She was found in her apartment in the central part of Jakarta, her body gruesomely beaten and stabbed. The discovery was made by her colleague, who had been trying to reach her after she missed an important deadline for her latest article. When the colleague arrived at her apartment, she found the door ajar and Siti's lifeless body lying on the floor, blood pooling around her. There were signs of a violent struggle, and it appeared that the attack had been swift and brutal. The news of Siti's murder quickly became a national story. The public was outraged by the crime, especially because of the prominent position she held in society and her reputation for speaking out against injustice. Many suspected that her work had made her enemies among those in power who might have seen her as a threat. The case also highlighted the dangerous environment in which journalists were working in Indonesia during the mid-1990s. At the time of her death, Indonesia was under the authoritarian rule of President Suharto, whose government maintained a tight grip on the media and often censored critical reporting. Journalists who exposed government corruption or human rights violations often faced harassment, intimidation, or even violence. It was in this environment of fear and control that Siti Hawa's murder took place. Her death was seen by many as a direct attack on press freedom and a warning to others who dared to challenge the status quo. The initial police investigation into Siti's murder was slow and disorganized. Jakarta's police force, which had limited experience in handling high-profile cases, faced significant challenges. There was little forensic evidence at the crime scene, and the apartment had been ransacked, suggesting that the murderer had searched for something. At first, the police suspected that the murder might have been a robbery gone wrong. However, as they delved deeper into Siti's life and work, they began to suspect that her killing might have been linked to her journalistic investigations. Siti's colleagues, friends, and family all believed that her death was not a random act of violence. They pointed to her recent articles, which had exposed the activities of several powerful individuals and corporations involved in illegal practices. In particular, she had been investigating a major logging company that had close ties to high-ranking officials in the government. The company had been accused of illegal deforestation in protected areas, a story that had angered many influential figures. Citi had been working on an expose that was set to reveal the full extent of the company's operations, and it was speculated that her murder was intended to prevent her from publishing the piece. In the months that followed, the investigation into Citi's death drew public attention, but progress was slow. The police seemed to lack the resources and political will to investigate thoroughly, and there was a widespread perception that the authorities were reluctant to pursue the case too aggressively. Many believed that the people responsible for her murder were too powerful to be held accountable. The investigation began to stall, and many feared that the case would eventually be forgotten, as so many others had been. However, in the summer of 1996, a breakthrough occurred. A former employee of the logging company that Citi had been investigating came forward with crucial information. This employee, who had worked as a security guard for the company, claimed that he had witnessed suspicious activity in the days leading up to Citi's murder. According to the whistleblower, a group of men had been seen entering Citi's apartment building several times, and he had overheard conversations about silencing a journalist. The security guard had been hesitant to speak out at first, fearing for his own safety, but he was eventually convinced to come forward. The new information prompted the police to refocus their investigation on the logging company and its connections to powerful individuals within the government. Soon, it became clear that Citi's murder was not a random act of violence, but a premeditated attack carried out by hired assassins. The police identified several suspects who had been linked to the company, including high-ranking officials and businessmen who stood to lose significant financial interests if Citi's story were published. The evidence pointed to a well-organized conspiracy to silence Citi once and for all. As the investigation continued, the authorities were able to trace the movement of the suspects and uncover evidence linking them to the crime. Several individuals were arrested and charged with the murder, including 2 men who were directly involved in the physical attack. They had been hired by the company to kill Citi and prevent the publication of her expose. The trial that followed was widely covered by the media and became a symbol of the fight for press freedom in Indonesia. Though the trial was an important step forward, it was far from straightforward. The accused men claimed they had been acting on orders from higher-ups within the company, but no one in the company's leadership was ever directly charged with ordering the murder. Some believed that the true masterminds behind Citi's death had been protected by their political connections. Despite this, the conviction of the 2 men involved in the killing was seen as a partial victory for justice. Citi Hawa's murder left an indelible mark on Indonesian society. Her death underscored the dangerous environment in which journalists operated during that period, and it became a rallying cry for those advocating for press freedom. Although the case was not fully resolved and many of the individuals who orchestrated the murder remained unpunished, it sparked a broader conversation about the need for reforms in Indonesia's political and media landscape. Her murder ultimately led to increased efforts by civil society groups to push for greater protections for journalists and to combat corruption in both the public and private sectors. The legacy of Citi Hawa's bravery in reporting the truth remained an inspiration for future generations of journalists in Southeast Asia. Following Citi Hawa's tragic death, the case continued to raise important questions about the safety of journalists and the broader implications of a press environment under an authoritarian regime. In Indonesia, freedom of the press had long been suppressed under President Suharto's rule, which led to the concentration of power in the hands of a few individuals. Journalists who dared to speak out against the government or powerful business interests risked harassment, imprisonment, and, as in Citi's case, even death. Her murder highlighted how dangerous it could be to challenge the political and corporate elites, and it sent a chilling message to other journalists across the region. The aftermath of Citi's death also brought to light the limitations and vulnerabilities of the Indonesian police force, which struggled to effectively investigate the case. At the time, the country's police were seen as inefficient and often compromised by political interference. The fact that it took months for the investigation to make any significant progress was a stark reflection of how deeply embedded corruption was within law enforcement. Citi's murder revealed how difficult it was for the police to go after high-profile individuals, especially those linked to the political elite or influential businesses. This corruption, or at the very least the fear of confronting powerful individuals, made the investigation even more challenging. Despite the slow start, the breakthrough came when the whistleblower from the logging company provided crucial information. His testimony served as the catalyst that reignited the case, pointing the authorities toward the real perpetrators. However, the broader question remained, Could justice be fully achieved when the higher-ups, who were believed to have orchestrated the murder, remained untouched by the legal process? The whistleblower's information helped bring the case to light in a way that many had hoped for, but few expected. His courage in coming forward revealed a significant part of the conspiracy, and although it was a step toward justice, it also raised doubts about the full extent of the crime and the true nature of the powers involved. The fact that the murder had been planned and carried out by hired hitmen indicated a level of coordination, an intent that went beyond a personal vendetta or spontaneous violence. The professional nature of the attack pointed to a deeper conspiracy, likely involving people who believed that silencing City Hawa was worth the risk of violence. The trial itself became a landmark moment for Indonesia. It not only brought attention to the issue of press freedom, but also to the degree of corporate and governmental corruption that had taken root in the country. The accusations against the logging company executives and the government officials who were implicated created public outrage. For the first time in Indonesia, there was a public acknowledgement of the lengths to which powerful interests would go to protect their wealth and silence those who exposed their wrongdoings. However, despite the growing public pressure, the trial was far from perfect. Although the two men who physically carried out the murder were convicted, the company executives and government officials who allegedly orchestrated the crime remained untouched. The trial and its outcome also raised questions about the ability of the judiciary in Indonesia to act independently of the government and big business interests. Many observers believed that the judiciary was still heavily influenced by the political elite and that justice was often compromised when powerful figures were involved. The fact that the mastermind behind the murder was never fully identified or prosecuted led many to believe that the justice system had failed in delivering a truly fair outcome. Nevertheless, City's murder did have some far-reaching effects. It became a significant case in the ongoing battle for press freedom in Indonesia. The case was widely discussed at local and international levels with press freedom organizations, human rights groups, and journalists from across the globe calling for greater protection for media professionals. While the Suharto regime remained in power at the time, the murder sparked a movement that questioned the role of the press in a democratic society and the government's treatment of those who dared to challenge it. In the wake of City's death, a wave of solidarity emerged from the media community. Journalists began to form organizations to advocate for their safety, and some risked their lives to continue speaking out. City's colleagues and fellow reporters vowed to continue her work, with many dedicating their articles and investigations to her memory. Her death served as a rallying cry for those who believed that the press had a critical role to play in uncovering corruption and holding the powerful accountable. It reminded the Indonesian public that even in an environment dominated by censorship and political repression, the pursuit of truth remained vital to the functioning of any society. Moreover, her murder became part of a broader conversation across Southeast Asia about the rights of journalists and the dangers they face in countries with repressive regimes. Southeast Asia, in the mid-1990s, was a region where press freedom was continually under threat, especially in countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, where political power was tightly controlled and independent reporting was often seen as a challenge to the status quo. City's death marked a significant point in the struggle for press freedom in the region, as it demonstrated the lengths to which those in power would go to protect their interests from scrutiny. Despite the mounting pressure from domestic and international communities, many of the powerful figures responsible for orchestrating City Hawa's murder were never fully brought to justice. The case remained a symbol of the dangerous intersection between politics, business, and media in Southeast Asia. While two of the individuals directly responsible for her death were convicted, the fact that the broader network of individuals and companies involved were able to escape prosecution remained a bitter pill for many to swallow. Nonetheless, the case also marked a critical turning point in Indonesian journalism. It encouraged a new generation of reporters to dig deeper into stories of corruption and human rights abuses, even if it meant risking their lives. City's bravery in the face of adversity and the subsequent public outcry over her murder brought global attention to the need for greater protections for journalists. Although her life was tragically cut short, her legacy lived on in the ongoing fight for press freedom, a struggle that would continue well beyond the Suharto era. The lessons of her murder remained etched in the memory of the Indonesian public, ensuring that the importance of a free press and the courage to seek truth would not be forgotten. As the years passed, the legacy of Siti Hawa's murder continued to resonate throughout Indonesia and the broader Southeast Asian region. While there were some tangible reforms in the wake of her death, including greater attention to journalists' safety and press freedom, the broader political and business climate remained deeply intertwined with corruption and power struggles. Siti's murder and the slow pace of justice that followed made it clear that the fight for press freedom in Southeast Asia was far from over. In the years following the trial, the Indonesian government began to face increased pressure from both local and international human rights organizations, as well as the Indonesian public, to ensure the safety of journalists and to make meaningful reforms. While there was some progress, such as a reduction in censorship and more protections for reporters, the issue of impunity for powerful figures remained a significant challenge. Many journalists continued to report under the shadow of intimidation and violence, knowing full well that the law might not protect them if they found themselves in a similar situation to Siti Hawa. Siti's case also brought renewed attention to the conditions of media professionals working under authoritarian regimes across Southeast Asia. In countries like Malaysia, Thailand, and Singapore, where government control over the media remained significant, the threat of violence, imprisonment, or harassment loomed over journalists who dared to challenge the political order. As such, the murder of Siti Hawa was not just a wake-up call for Indonesia, but for the entire region. One of the more profound effects of her death was the way it contributed to the global discourse on the role of the media in democracy. Siti's tragic end highlighted the dangerous consequences that could arise when the press was stifled, and it drew international attention to the struggles of journalists in Southeast Asia. Organizations like Reporters Without Borders, RSF, and the Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, pointed to her murder as emblematic of the wider dangers journalists faced in regions where press freedom was under threat. The international media also covered the case extensively, bringing attention to the lack of accountability and the challenges faced by those who attempted to expose powerful interests. Although Indonesia's political environment began to change after Suharto's fall from power in 1998, the country's press freedom situation remained fragile. Journalists continued to face threats, and media outlets often struggled with censorship and interference from powerful political and business elites. However, Siti Hawa's case remained a constant reminder of the risks and sacrifices involved in investigative journalism. Her memory served as an inspiration for a generation of journalists who were committed to telling the truth, even at great personal cost. The murder had also led to an important shift in how journalists approached their work. In the wake of her death, many investigative reporters became more cautious, understanding the potential risks involved. Some began to adopt more secure practices, utilizing encrypted communications and taking additional precautions in the field. However, while these changes were important in ensuring the safety of journalists, the deeper issue of impunity for those responsible for violence against the press remained unresolved. In 2000, a memorial for Siti Hawa was established in Jakarta, funded by a collective of media organizations and civil society groups. The memorial served as both a tribute to her legacy and a symbol of the ongoing fight for press freedom in Indonesia. Journalists, activists, and members of the public gathered at the memorial to honor her contributions to the country's media landscape and to reflect on the progress made in the fight for a freer press. While there was still much work to be done, the creation of the memorial was seen as a positive step toward keeping her memory alive and ensuring that the cause of press freedom would not be forgotten. Despite the lack of full accountability for Siti Hawa's murder, her legacy had far-reaching effects on both Indonesian society and Southeast Asia's media landscape. Her death galvanized many in the region to continue the struggle for the protection of journalists and the establishment of legal frameworks that would allow for greater media independence. In countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, where journalists faced regular harassment, threats, and violence, the murder of Siti Hawa served as a stark reminder of the importance of safeguarding the press. Siti's work had always been driven by a commitment to uncovering the truth, no matter the cost. She had worked tirelessly to expose corruption and hold those in power accountable, often at great personal risk. In the years following her death, many journalists continued to follow in her footsteps, refusing to back down from their duty to report the truth. Although Siti Hawa was no longer alive to continue her work, her spirit lived on in the courageous journalists who, inspired by her example, took on the task of challenging the powerful and exposing corruption in Indonesia and beyond. Her murder remains a defining moment in the history of press freedom in Southeast Asia, not only because of the injustice that followed, but also because of the way it sparked a broader conversation about the role of media in a healthy democracy. While the fight for press freedom and the safety of journalists is ongoing, Sidi Hawa's death highlighted the immense challenges journalists face and the risks they take to expose the truth. In conclusion, the murder of Sidi Hawa was more than just a tragic event. It was a turning point in the fight for press freedom in Southeast Asia. While her death left an unfillable void, her courage and dedication to truth became an enduring symbol for journalists and activists in the region. Despite the obstacles, her story remains a testament to the power of the press to challenge authority, hold the powerful accountable, and give a voice to those who have none. Sidi Hawa's legacy is a reminder of the critical importance of press freedom and the need to protect those who put their lives on the line to report the truth. Let's jump to next story. Story 7. In 1997, Southeast Asia was plunged into a severe economic crisis that reshaped the region in profound ways. However, amidst the economic turmoil, one of the most shocking and deeply tragic events in the region was the kidnapping and murder of a prominent businessman in the Philippines. This case, which unfolded in the middle of a nationwide financial crisis, drew national and international attention, and highlighted the vulnerabilities in the political and economic systems that contributed to such a heinous crime. The victim, Donato Tony Perez, was a well-known and highly influential businessman based in Manila. Perez was the head of one of the largest family-run conglomerates in the country, with significant holdings in various industries, including real estate, banking, and hospitality. Known for his success and business acumen, Perez had worked his way up from humble beginnings, eventually building a fortune that made him one of the wealthiest and most powerful figures in the Philippines. Despite his wealth, Perez had earned a reputation for his commitment to corporate social responsibility, often investing in public infrastructure and philanthropic ventures. However, his rise to prominence was not without controversy. His business dealings, which were often associated with government contracts and political figures, had raised questions about the ethics of his business practices. Perez was known to have close connections with powerful political leaders, particularly within the ruling elite of the time. His family's wealth and influence made him a key figure in both business and political circles, but this very position made him a target for criminal elements who sought to take advantage of his high profile. On the evening of October 5, 1997, Perez was abducted from his luxury home in the heart of Manila. The kidnappers, armed and masked, stormed into his residence, overpowering his personal security team. It was reported that the kidnapping took place just as Perez was about to retire for the night. The perpetrators quickly restrained him, bound him, and forced him into a van, making off with him in a matter of minutes. The entire ordeal was swift and seemingly well coordinated, suggesting that the kidnappers had done their homework and had a clear plan of action. What made the kidnapping especially shocking was the level of preparation involved. The criminals were not ordinary thugs. They were organized and skilled in executing such a high-profile crime. The fact that Perez's security team, which was known to be well-trained and equipped, could not prevent the abduction indicated that the perpetrators had inside information or resources that allowed them to carry out the kidnapping with apparent ease. The van used in the crime was stolen earlier that day, and it was reported that the perpetrators had meticulously planned their route, ensuring they avoided security cameras and police checkpoints. It became apparent that this was not a random act of violence, but rather a targeted kidnapping aimed at a specific goal: extortion. Within hours of the abduction, Perez's family received a chilling phone call. The kidnappers, speaking in a calm but stern voice, demanded an enormous ransom for his safe release. The sum they requested was one of the largest ransom demands in the country's history at the time, an astronomical $10 million. The family, shocked and devastated, immediately contacted the police, who began a coordinated search to track down the perpetrators. The kidnapping sent ripples through the nation, as it was seen as a direct attack on one of the country's most influential business leaders. The news of Perez's kidnapping struck a nerve across the country. The Philippines had already been reeling from the effects of the 1997 Asian financial crisis, which had wreaked havoc on the local economy. And the kidnapping served as a stark reminder of the extent to which criminal syndicates were operating in the country. It was not the first high-profile kidnapping in the Philippines, but the audacity and scale of Perez's abduction suggested that the criminals behind it were emboldened by the economic instability and political climate of the time. The kidnapping triggered widespread fear and panic, especially among the business elite in Manila, who began to question the safety of their families and effectiveness of the authorities in handling such high-profile cases. The response from the police was swift, but also marked by a sense of helplessness. While the investigation was launched immediately, the authorities struggled to gather any solid leads. The kidnappers were experienced and knew how to cover their tracks, leaving little for the police to work with. For several days, the authorities were unable to trace Perez's location, despite their best efforts to follow the trail of the criminals. As the days passed, the pressure on the police and the government to secure Perez's release grew. The family was in constant contact with the kidnappers, who periodically called to ensure that the ransom demand was still being considered. They provided no guarantees about Perez's safety, and each conversation grew increasingly ominous. The family, desperate and afraid for his life, began negotiating with the kidnappers, even as they scrambled to raise the money. Meanwhile, the police had their own methods of investigation, including surveillance, wiretapping, and the use of informants. They were working around the clock to gather intelligence, but their progress was slow. It seemed that the criminals were always one step ahead. Despite the high-profile nature of the case and the immense pressure on law enforcement, there were no major breakthroughs. The days dragged on, and Perez's family began to grow more desperate, fearing that time was running out. It was during this period of uncertainty that the first significant clue emerged. A member of the kidnapping syndicate, who had been in custody for an unrelated crime, began to provide information to the police. The suspect claimed that he knew the identity of the leader of the gang and provided them with a possible location where Perez might be held. This lead gave the police new hope, and they quickly mobilized a special task force to investigate further. The task force, consisting of experienced detectives and specialized units, was able to trace the suspect's information to a remote safe house in a suburb of Manila. The authorities believed that Perez was being held there, and they prepared for a rescue operation. However, before the authorities could carry out the operation, the situation took a tragic turn. On October 12, 1997, just 7 days after his abduction, Donato Perez's lifeless body was found in a secluded area on the outskirts of Manila. His body had been dumped in a remote location, showing signs of torture. It was clear that the kidnappers had not been willing to release him, even after the ransom negotiations had begun. The police were left with a broken and incomplete case, as the criminals responsible for Perez's murder had already vanished, taking with them their secrets. Perez's death sparked national outrage. His murder was seen as a symbol of the breakdown of law and order in the country, and many questioned the ability of the government to protect its citizens from increasingly bold criminal enterprises. The loss of a prominent businessman in such a violent manner left a deep scar on the nation's psyche, and it became a rallying cry for those seeking justice for victims of organized crime. The investigation into Perez's kidnapping and murder continued for months, but the authorities struggled to track down the culprits. The criminal syndicate responsible for the crime was believed to be part of a larger network of kidnapping gangs operating in the region, some of which had ties to powerful political figures. These syndicates were involved in a wide range of criminal activities, from extortion to drug trafficking, and their reach extended deep into both the political and business sectors. Despite the challenges, the police and the Perez family vowed to keep pushing for justice, even as the investigation hit roadblocks. The case of Donato Tony, Perez remains one of the most notorious kidnappings in Philippine history, highlighting the complex relationship between crime, politics, and business in the region. His death underscored the risks faced by both the political elite and ordinary citizens in a society struggling with corruption and lawlessness. The aftermath of Donato Tony Perez's kidnapping and murder had long-lasting implications for the Philippines and the broader Southeast Asian region. His tragic death exposed the dangerous intersection between organized crime, political corruption, and business interests, particularly in a country where the rule of law was often undermined by powerful elites and criminal syndicates. While the authorities continued to search for the individuals responsible for his death, the case also brought attention to deeper systemic issues that went beyond this particular crime. The failure to bring Perez's kidnappers to justice underscored the difficulties the Philippine government faced in dealing with increasingly sophisticated criminal organizations. These criminal syndicates, which had become a significant force in the country, were often able to operate with impunity. The murder of Perez revealed how some of these groups were deeply embedded in the socio-political fabric, with connections to influential politicians, business leaders, and law enforcement officers. Their ability to conduct high-profile crimes like abductions, extortion, and even murder without fear of immediate consequences painted a grim picture of the country's criminal justice system. One of the most concerning aspects of the Perez case was the apparent ease with which the kidnappers were able to carry out the crime. Despite the victim's high profile and the presence of security measures around his home, the abduction had been executed with military precision. This raised questions about the effectiveness of the security forces in dealing with organized crime and the ability of wealthy individuals to protect themselves. The kidnappers knew exactly when and how to strike, exploiting the weaknesses in the system and ensuring they could avoid detection for as long as possible. The fact that Perez's body was found weeks later in a remote area further suggested that the criminals behind the kidnapping were adept at covering their tracks. In response to Perez's death, the Philippine government, under President Fidel V. Ramos, was pressured to act decisively. While the immediate public outrage was intense, it soon became clear that the criminal syndicates responsible for such high-profile kidnappings were not easily dismantled. In fact, the government's attempts to curtail organized crime met with limited success. The case of Perez was just one among many, and his murder highlighted the broader issue of security for both the political elite and the general public. Despite efforts to address the problem, kidnapping for ransom remained a major concern in the Philippines, particularly in economically marginalized areas where criminal syndicates thrive. The public outcry also led to increased scrutiny of the business and political elites' relationship with these syndicates. While the authorities did their best to track down the criminals, the investigation revealed that some of the kidnappers had links to powerful figures in both business and politics. In some cases, it appeared that certain individuals might have profited from the crime or may have been involved in facilitating the abduction. These revelations only deepened the mistrust between the public and the government, which was already dealing with widespread corruption scandals and a growing lack of confidence in its institutions. The case of Perez also raised uncomfortable questions about the role of wealth and privilege in Filipino society. The fact that one of the country's most powerful businessmen was so easily targeted for ransom underscored the vulnerability of even the richest and most influential members of society to organized crime. It also highlighted the deep social divisions in the country, where the gap between the wealthy elite and the impoverished majority was growing ever wider. In this environment, criminal organizations were able to exploit the fear and insecurity felt by both the rich and the poor. Despite the lack of full accountability in Perez's case, the investigation sparked important conversations about the need for reform in the country's law enforcement and criminal justice systems. Calls for better training for police officers, more resources to combat organized crime, and stronger safeguards against political and business corruption grew louder. Many in the media and civil society began pushing for changes that would address the root causes of such crimes, including inequality, poverty, and the concentration of power in the hands of a few. Over time, the Perez case also became a symbol of the broader challenges faced by the Philippines in the late 1990s. The 1997 Asian financial crisis had exacerbated existing social and economic problems, and the country was struggling to recover from the devastating effects of the economic downer. At the same time, political instability and corruption continued to undermine efforts to reform the country. This created an environment in which criminal syndicates flourished, taking advantage of the government's inability to effectively enforce the law and protect citizens from harm. For many, Perez's murder was a stark reminder of the high price of wealth and influence in a society where justice was often elusive. His family, devastated by the loss, worked tirelessly to keep his memory alive and to seek justice for his death. However, for the larger public, the case became an emblem of the challenges of living in a country where both the wealthy and the vulnerable could fall prey to organized crime, and where the state often seemed powerless to protect them. As time passed, the Philippines saw some improvements in the handling of kidnappings and extortion cases. The government created specialized anti-kidnapping units within law enforcement, and there was increased cooperation between police forces and other countries in Southeast Asia to dismantle cross-border criminal syndicates. However, many felt that much more needed to be done to address the systemic issues that allowed such crimes to thrive. The Perez case would remain etched in the public consciousness, serving as both a cautionary tale and a call for greater accountability, transparency, and reform in the Philippines. In the end, Although justice was never fully served for Donato Perez and his family, his death became a turning point in the conversation about the challenges facing the Philippines. It was a reminder that, even in times of economic and political crisis, the government's ability to protect its citizens from violence and crime was paramount. Perez's case underscored the need for both structural reforms and a renewed commitment to tackling corruption, inequality, and organized crime. His legacy would continue to inspire those who sought to reform the system, even as the nation grappled with its many challenges in the years that followed. In the years since the murder, Perez's family continued their efforts to raise awareness about the dangers of organized crime in the Philippines and to promote reforms that would help prevent such tragedies in the future. The case remains one of the most significant and haunting moments in the history of organized crime in Southeast Asia, with echoes of its consequences still felt today. Let's jump to next story. Story 8. In 1998, Southeast Asia was in the midst of profound political and economic upheaval, with one of the most defining events in the region being the Asian financial crisis, which began in 1997. Countries across Southeast Asia were experiencing severe financial struggles with collapsing currencies, rising unemployment, and an increasing sense of public unrest. This economic instability provided fertile ground for corruption, unrest, and even violence. Amidst this turmoil, the Philippines was shaken by the brutal murder of a prominent Filipino public official, which highlighted the deepening social and political instability within the country. The victim, Rodolfo June Daza, was a well-known figure in the Philippines' political landscape. He had served as a government official, holding several important posts over the years, including serving as a member of the House of Representatives. Daza was respected for his involvement in social justice and his outspoken criticism of the corruption that plagued the government. He was a proponent of transparency and accountability, regularly speaking out against the excesses of the political elite and their connection to wealthy business interests. His strong position on governmental corruption made him a target, as he had many enemies among the powerful figures he frequently challenged. On the morning of April 28, 1998, Daza was shot dead in his office in Manila, an event that shook the nation to its core. The assassination took place in the heart of the capital, with his staff and colleagues horrified by the events that unfolded. Witnesses reported hearing gunshots from inside his office, followed by the frantic screams of his colleagues and staff as they realized that their boss had been attacked. As soon as the police arrived at the scene, it was clear that Daza had been assassinated with precision and intent. His body was found lying in a pool of blood, and evidence suggested that the crime was well planned. The details surrounding his assassination were chilling. Daza was known for being a vocal critic of corruption and for his calls for greater accountability within government and business. His views often put him at odds with powerful individuals who had ties to the political establishment and major corporations. It became clear that his murder was not a random act of violence, but rather a targeted killing aimed at silencing a man who had made powerful enemies. The nature of the crime suggested that the perpetrators were organized and knew exactly who they were targeting. The police investigation into Daza's murder was launched immediately, and the authorities quickly began to piece together the details surrounding the crime. However, the case was marked by difficulties from the outset. The murder of a high-profile political figure was bound to draw attention, and the authorities were under intense pressure to solve the case and bring the perpetrators to justice. But as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the killing was connected to larger issues of political corruption, organized crime, and the power struggles within the Filipino political elite. In the first few days after Daza's murder, police began to question his colleagues, friends, and family, hoping to uncover any leads that might point to the identity of the assassin or the mastermind behind the crime. However, witnesses were reluctant to come forward as the fear of retribution hung heavily over them. In the Philippines, political violence had been a long-standing problem, and many individuals were hesitant to testify, knowing the possible consequences. As a result, the investigation initially progressed slowly. Despite the challenges, the authorities were able to gather some important pieces of information. They learned that Daza had been involved in several investigations into government corruption, particularly regarding the misuse of funds and illicit business dealings between government officials and private companies. These investigations had made Daza a thorn in the side of powerful individuals who were determined to protect their interests. His outspoken criticism of these figures likely contributed to his untimely death. As the investigation continued, it became apparent that Daza's murder was part of a larger pattern of violence directed at individuals who were seen as threats to the established political and business elites. In the years leading up to his assassination, several other journalists, activists, and public figures had been killed under similar circumstances. Their murders were often attributed to either direct political motivations or the involvement of organized crime syndicates that had ties to the ruling class. Daza's death in this context seemed to be part of a broader effort to intimidate those who dared to speak out against corruption and abuses of power. The case also revealed the deep influence of organized crime syndicates in Philippine politics. These groups, often composed of individuals with both criminal and political connections, had a long history of using violence to protect their interests. They frequently operated with impunity, knowing that they had powerful allies who could help shield them from prosecution. The level of coordination and the sophisticated nature of Daza's assassination suggested that the perpetrators were likely part of such a syndicate, or at the very least had access to their resources. In the weeks following Daza's death, public outrage grew as details about the assassination continued to unfold. Many in the media and civil society expressed anger over the state of corruption in the Philippines, and the apparent ease with which criminals could eliminate their political opponents. The murder of Daza was seen as a direct challenge to the country's democratic institutions and to the rule of law. It highlighted the dangerous climate of impunity that existed for those who committed acts of political violence. International observers also took notice of the case, with foreign governments and organizations expressing concern over the state of political violence and human rights in the Philippines. The United States and several European countries issued statements calling for a thorough investigation into Daza's murder and for those responsible to be brought to justice. These calls for accountability underscored the growing international pressure on the Philippine government to address the systemic issues that allowed such violence to occur. In the meantime, the investigation continued to stall. Despite the public outcry, the authorities struggled to gather substantial evidence that could lead to the identification and capture of the killers. Police received several tips and leads, but each one seemed to lead to dead ends. There were several suspects who had connections to the political and business elites, but no one was able to definitively prove their involvement in the crime. Many believed that the investigation was being deliberately obstructed by individuals with vested interests in keeping the truth hidden. The case remained unsolved for months, with the lack of progress in the investigation fueling public frustration. Many people, particularly Daza supporters, began to lose hope that justice would ever be served. It became increasingly clear that the political climate in the Philippines, with its deep-rooted corruption and the pervasive influence of organized crime, made it incredibly difficult for any meaningful justice to prevail. Despite the slow pace of the investigation, the murder of Rodolfo Daza ultimately became a symbol of the ongoing struggle for justice and transparency in the Philippines. His assassination illuminated the dangers faced by those who sought to challenge the political status quo, and it served as a stark reminder of the risks involved in speaking out against corruption. The case would go down in history as one of the most tragic and emblematic political murders of the late 1990s, a turning point in the country's battle against political violence and the entrenched systems of corruption that allowed it to flourish. As 1998 progressed, the death of Rodolfo Daza left a deep scar on the political landscape of the Philippines. His murder highlighted the vulnerabilities of democratic institutions in the face of political violence, organized crime, and corruption. Though the investigation into his death remained unresolved, his legacy would inspire future generations of activists, journalists, and public servants who would continue to fight for a more transparent and just society, despite the ever-present threats posed by those in power. The murder of Rodolfo June Daza, despite remaining unsolved for a significant period, left a deep imprint on Philippine politics and its society. His assassination catalyzed a public reckoning with the state of corruption and the political violence that permeated the country during the late 1990s. The Daza case revealed disturbing truths about the intersection of business, politics, and organized crime in the Philippines, and it highlighted the danger faced by those who dared to challenge the entrenched power structures. In the years following his death, the case remained a source of intense public scrutiny, particularly in the context of the broader climate of violence against public figures. It became apparent that the country was dealing with systemic issues that extended beyond a single murder, and many began to understand that political violence was not just an isolated phenomenon, but part of a larger, more sinister pattern. The murder of Daza was not an anomaly, but rather a reflection of the climate of fear and impunity that allowed criminal syndicates and corrupt officials to operate with little fear of consequence. In the aftermath of the assassination, there was increased international attention focused on the Philippines, as human rights organizations, foreign governments, and political analysts raised concerns about the state of the nation's democratic institutions. Reports by the International Federation for Human Rights, FIDH, and other advocacy groups highlighted how political violence, often committed with the support of powerful individuals or groups, had become a significant threat to the rule of law in the country. Daza's murder was seen as another stark example of how impunity for perpetrators of political violence was eroding the trust that ordinary Filipinos had in their government. Amid this growing international scrutiny, the Philippines government found itself under mounting pressure to address its political and security challenges. Some reformists and civil society leaders pushed for greater accountability within law enforcement, calling for stronger protections for whistleblowers, journalists, and political figures who were at risk. However, the entrenched political elites were resistant to change, and many feared that any significant reforms would undermine the very systems that enabled them to maintain their power. The lack of justice in Daza's case sent a message that those who wielded political and economic power in the Philippines could avoid the consequences of their actions. Even as the case of his assassination remained unresolved, the public remained cynical about the likelihood of real reform. While many politicians voiced public outrage over his murder, there was a widespread belief that these condemnations were nothing more than lip service. The country's political elite, many of whom were themselves complicit in perpetuating corruption and cronyism, seemed unwilling to confront the systemic issues that enabled such violence. This disillusionment with the government grew as more individuals began to question the integrity of law enforcement and the judicial system. In the wake of Daza's death, many activists and political commentators argued that the true perpetrators of the crime, those who masterminded it, were likely part of the powerful political networks that had much to gain from silencing Daza. The way his murder was orchestrated, with precision and efficiency, suggested that it was carried out by individuals who had access to resources and intelligence within the government, organized crime, or both. This sense of conspiracy only fueled the suspicion that the authorities were not doing enough to investigate or were actively hindering the process to protect the true culprits. While Daza's family and supporters continued to seek justice, many felt that his death symbolized the broader struggles of ordinary Filipinos in a country where political violence had become a recurrent issue. With the political system rife with corruption and criminal syndicates often operating with tacit government approval, it seemed that those who fought for change were increasingly at risk of being silenced. His death was a clear signal of the price of standing against the system, a message that echoed throughout the country. Despite the slow progress of the investigation, the case inspired widespread public debate about the future of the Philippines. Activists, journalists, and other public figures began to speak out more forcefully, emphasizing the importance of transparency, accountability, and the protection of human rights. Although Daza's assassination seemed to suggest that those in power were untouchable, it also sparked renewed calls for reform and justice. His death was seen as a turning point for many, as it galvanized a generation of Filipinos who were committed to pushing back against the entrenched corruption and violence that had long dominated the political landscape. The murder also had lasting effects on how politicians interacted with the public. Many politicians began to distance themselves from corrupt practices, even if only publicly, in an attempt to rebuild public trust. However, these efforts often fell short as the political culture in the Philippines was slow to change. The fear of retaliation and the continuing dominance of influential political families made it difficult for reforms to take root. It became clear that to address the systemic issues of corruption and violence, it would take much more than public statements and token gestures. It would require a fundamental shift in the political culture. In terms of law enforcement, the Daza case led to some reevaluations of police methods and investigative practices. The police were under increasing pressure to solve high-profile cases, but it was evident that institutional weaknesses remained. Investigators faced difficulties in gathering information from reluctant witnesses and were often unable to penetrate the layers of secrecy and corruption that protected those responsible for political violence. There was a growing sense that the Philippine National Police (PNP) was ill-equipped to tackle organized crime syndicates or political murders without deeper reform. This lack of efficacy further eroded public confidence in law enforcement and the criminal justice system as a whole. As the years passed, the Daza case became part of the larger narrative of political violence in the Philippines. His murder served as a symbol of the risks faced by those who challenged the political elite, but it also highlighted the country's struggle to address its long-standing issues of inequality, corruption, and impunity. Daza's murder was not an isolated incident, but rather a continuation of a long history of violence against those who sought to reform the political system. In a broader sense, the unresolved case of Rodolfo Daza became a cautionary tale for future political figures and activists in the Philippines. It was a stark reminder that the pursuit of justice, especially in a climate of corruption and violence, often comes at great personal cost. While his death did not lead to the immediate changes many had hoped for, it sparked a dialogue that would continue for years to come. His memory became a rallying point for those in the country who demanded more from their leaders and hoped for a future where justice and transparency prevailed. By 1999, despite the continued lack of closure in Daza's murder, the case remained an enduring symbol of the struggle for accountability in a system fraught with corruption and violence. As the country slowly recovered from the financial crisis of 1997, the lessons learned from Daza's assassination were not forgotten. His death, while a personal tragedy for his family and loved ones, became a turning point in the broader fight for a more transparent and just Philippines. Let's jump to next story. Story 9. In 1999, Southeast Asia was a region filled with turmoil, with political instability, economic challenges, and a rise in criminal activities. One particular case that shocked the region and drew widespread attention was the murder of a prominent Indonesian human rights activist, Munir Setalib, in September 1999. Munir's murder became one of the most notorious political crimes in Indonesia's post-Suharto era, and it brought into sharp focus the dangers faced by individuals who dared to confront the government's corruption and human rights abuses. Munir, at the time of his death, was a leading figure in Indonesia's civil society. Known for his work with the Indonesian Commission for Missing Persons and Victims of Violence, Contras, he was a staunch advocate for human rights, particularly in advocating for the victims of the political violence that had plagued Indonesia during the Suharto regime. Throughout the 1990s, Munir tirelessly campaigned against military and police abuses, as well as the disappearance of activists and dissidents during the period of authoritarian rule under Suharto. The political landscape in Indonesia was going through a significant transformation in 1999. Suharto, who had been in power for over 30 years, resigned in 1998 amidst a series of political protests and economic collapse. His resignation was followed by the rise of a more democratic government under President B.J. Habibie, and Munir became a key figure in the movement for justice for those who had been persecuted and disappeared during the authoritarian years. As the country transitioned to democracy, Munir's efforts to uncover the truth behind human rights violations were not without resistance from those within the military, the police, and the political elite, many of whom were deeply invested in preserving the status quo. Munir's activism made him a target for many in the Indonesian establishment. His work at Contras and his vocal criticism of government corruption and human rights abuses drew the ire of powerful groups who had benefited from the Suharto regime. His efforts to expose past atrocities such as the 1991 Santa Cruz massacre in East Timor, where Indonesian military forces killed hundreds of civilians, and his advocacy for justice for the victims of forced disappearances were seen as deeply threatening by the Indonesian military, which was implicated in many of these crimes. On September 7, 1999, Munir boarded a Garuda Indonesia flight to Amsterdam, where he was scheduled to give a lecture on human rights, and to continue his work advocating for the victims of human rights violations in Indonesia. However, during the flight, Munir began to feel seriously ill. He was found unconscious in his seat by fellow passengers, and despite efforts by the flight attendants and medical personnel to revive him, he was declared dead upon arrival at the Schiphol airport in Amsterdam. An initial assessment suggested that he had died from natural causes, such as a heart attack. However, his colleagues, family members, and human rights activists immediately suspected foul play, given Munir's high-profile position and the nature of his work. In the weeks following his death, an investigation was launched to determine the cause. The results of the autopsy in the Netherlands soon confirmed the worst fears of his supporters. Munir had been poisoned. The poison found in his system was identified as arsenic, a deadly substance that causes acute poisoning, and can result in death if ingested in sufficient quantities. It was clear that Munir had been murdered, and the discovery sent shockwaves throughout Indonesia and the international community. It quickly became apparent that Munir's death was not the result of a random act of violence, but rather a targeted assassination, likely orchestrated by those who had long viewed him as a threat. The murder of Munir immediately raised questions about the state of Indonesia's transition to democracy. Was the country's new government truly committed to justice, or were remnants of the old regime still pulling the strings? Munir's death seemed to suggest that elements within the Indonesian military or intelligence services, who had been involved in past human rights abuses, were still operating with impunity. His murder also highlighted the dangers faced by human rights activists in the country, particularly those who dared to challenge powerful, entrenched forces. The fact that Munir was killed while traveling abroad added another layer of complexity to the investigation. Could the government of Indonesia be involved in his murder? Or was this a case of rogue elements operating outside the law? As the investigation unfolded, the focus quickly turned to Garuda Indonesia, the state-owned airline on which Munir was traveling. The flight crew and ground personnel came under intense scrutiny, and it was revealed that one of the flight attendants had been implicated in the poisoning. Polikarpus Budahari Prianto, a senior flight attendant on the Garuda flight, was arrested and charged with Munir's murder in 2004. However, the investigation into his role revealed a much larger conspiracy that was connected to elements within the Indonesian military and intelligence services. The arrest of Polikarpus Budahari Prianto and the investigation that followed revealed disturbing details about the depth of the conspiracy to kill Munir. It was uncovered that Prianto had been working with military intelligence officers who had allegedly planned the assassination. Reports suggested that Munir's name had been on a hit list compiled by military intelligence officials, and that his murder was part of a larger campaign to silence critics of the Indonesian government, particularly those who had been vocal about human rights abuses committed during the previous regime. The plot to kill Munir appeared to be a calculated move to prevent him from exposing further abuses, and to send a chilling message to other activists and journalists who were challenging the establishment. Despite the mounting evidence, the trial of Prianto and other suspects remained fraught with complications. The investigation was marred by political interference and attempts to downplay the significance of the crime. Many in the Indonesian government seemed reluctant to confront the full extent of the involvement of high-ranking officials in Munir's death, and the trial proceedings were heavily criticized for their lack of transparency. Munir's family and human rights groups continued to demand justice, but it was clear that the case was being deliberately obstructed at various levels. In the years following Munir's death, his assassination became a focal point for human rights advocacy in Indonesia. His murder was not only a tragic loss for his family and colleagues, but it also underscored the ongoing challenges facing the country's young democracy. The lack of swift and decisive action from the government in bringing all those responsible for Munir's murder to justice sparked public outrage and revealed the continuing impunity enjoyed by certain factions within the military and intelligence services. Munir's legacy, however, was far from forgotten. His death galvanized a new generation of human rights activists and journalists who were determined to continue his fight for justice. Munir's murder also served as a reminder of the dangers faced by those who challenge powerful interests in Southeast Asia. The assassination of such a prominent figure made it clear that, even in a country striving for democracy, there were still forces willing to use violence to silence dissent. His death marked a tragic chapter in Indonesia's struggle to overcome its past and build a future based on human rights and justice. The quest for justice for Munir would continue to unfold in the years to come, with activists, the international community, and his family remaining committed to uncovering the full truth about who was responsible for his assassination. As the case persisted into the early 2000s, the Indonesian government's reluctance to fully investigate Munir's murder served as a significant test of the country's democratic institutions. It remained an open question whether the political will exist to hold accountable those responsible for one of the most high-profile political assassinations in recent Indonesian history. For many, the murder of Munir was a stark reminder that the path to a truly democratic Indonesia was fraught with challenges, particularly in confronting the legacy of its authoritarian past. Despite the extensive efforts of human rights organizations, journalists, and Munir's family to seek justice for his murder, the investigation into his death continued to face significant obstacles. The Indonesian government, while publicly expressing condolences and promises to bring those responsible to justice, often seemed unwilling to fully confront the darker elements of its past. This reluctance to deal with the full extent of corruption, particularly in the military and intelligence sectors, hampered the effectiveness of the investigation. For many, the failure to prosecute all those involved in Munir's death underscored the persistent influence of the old regime and the difficulty of dismantling deeply entrenched systems of power. The trial of Polikarpus Budihari Prianto, the Garuda Indonesia flight attendant accused of poisoning Munir, began in 2004, but the legal proceedings were met with significant public skepticism. Prianto was eventually convicted of Munir's murder, receiving a 20-year prison sentence in 2005. However, many believe that his role was merely a small part of a much larger conspiracy. The full extent of the involvement of military intelligence officials, and whether there were any higher-ups behind the murder, was still largely unknown. The trial also failed to bring forward the names of others who might have been complicit, raising doubts about the thoroughness of the investigation. The fact that some of the key figures in the intelligence community were not even brought to trial further deepened the mistrust between the public and the government. Activists and political analysts argued that the trial was a smokescreen designed to quell public outrage without actually delivering justice. As time went on, many questioned whether the Indonesian government was actively covering up the full truth behind Munir's murder, fearing the exposure of widespread corruption within the state apparatus. Despite these challenges, Munir's death did not go unnoticed internationally. His murder garnered widespread condemnation from human rights organizations around the world, including organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the United Nations. These groups pressed the Indonesian government to demonstrate its commitment to human rights and justice by ensuring that all those involved in Munir's murder were held accountable. International pressure added another layer of scrutiny to the case, and while the Indonesian government publicly promised a thorough investigation, many believed the actual efforts were lacking. Meanwhile, the fight for justice for Munir continued to evolve into a significant cause for human rights defenders in Indonesia and beyond. Munir's widow Siti Mutmainah, also known as Siti Munir, became a prominent voice in the campaign for justice, continuing her late husband's work to seek truth and accountability. She led numerous protests, press conferences, and campaigns, urging the Indonesian government to fulfill its duty to bring those responsible to justice. Her persistence, along with that of Munir's colleagues, civil society organizations, and international allies, helped ensure that his murder remained a focal point in the struggle for human rights and democracy in Indonesia. One of the key turning points in the case came when a high-profile former human rights lawyer, Tommy Kokro, took on the case of Munir's murder in 2009. Kokro's involvement was instrumental in raising the profile of the case once again, bringing renewed attention to the gaps in the investigation. He and others in the human rights community continued to press for further investigations into the role of military intelligence officers who had worked closely with the suspects already on trial. The case, while stalled for years, continued to capture public interest and prompted periodic calls for deeper investigations into the assassination. The Indonesian government's ability to carry out an effective and independent investigation into Munir's murder continued to be questioned. The failure to expose the full conspiracy surrounding his assassination was seen as a broader symptom of the country's struggle to break free from the influence of powerful military and intelligence factions. Despite the fall of the Suharto regime in 1998, it was evident that elements of the old guard still had significant sway over the nation's institutions, including its legal and political systems. The unresolved nature of Munir's case and the unwillingness of the government to fully pursue justice represented a major setback for the country's democratization process. Even though the legal outcomes surrounding Munir's assassination were far from satisfying, his legacy was far-reaching. Munir's death ignited a widespread movement for justice and human rights reform in Indonesia. His murder was a stark reminder of the perils faced by those who dared to confront the deep-seated corruption and abuses of power that were still prevalent in the country's institutions. His case exposed the fragility of the nation's fledgling democracy and the challenges of ensuring accountability for past human rights violations. Munir's assassination also drew attention to the broader issue of the safety of human rights activists and political dissidents in Southeast Asia. Munir had been one of many individuals who had risked their lives to fight against state-sponsored violence, oppression, and corruption. His murder, alongside the lack of accountability for those responsible, set a dangerous precedent for other activists and journalists working in the region. The message was clear. Speaking out against the state could cost one's life, and the justice system might not always be there to protect those who dared to challenge the status quo. Although Indonesia had made significant strides in its transition to democracy since the end of Suharto's reign, the case of Munir's murder underscored the lingering challenges that the country still faced in achieving true democratic reforms. Political violence, impunity for state-sponsored crimes, and corruption within the military and intelligence services were all still very much present. Munir's death was a tragic reminder that these issues were not confined to the past, but remained deeply entrenched in the country's political landscape. In the years following Munir's assassination, his case continued to inspire new generations of human rights advocates, both in Indonesia and globally. His tireless dedication to truth, justice, and the protection of the vulnerable left an indelible mark on the fight for human rights in Southeast Asia. Despite the slow progress in the investigation and the lack of accountability for all those involved, Munir's murder ultimately served as a rallying cry for those who continued the struggle for a more just and democratic Indonesia. The tragic death of Munir will forever be remembered as one of the defining moments in Indonesia's history. His untimely murder highlighted the perils faced by those who challenged the establishment, but it also demonstrated the resilience of a nation's civil society in the face of adversity. Munir's legacy continues to inspire the fight for justice, and his name remains synonymous with the struggle for human rights in Indonesia, Southeast Asia, and beyond. Let's jump to next story. Story 10. In 1999, Southeast Asia witnessed numerous criminal cases that shook the region. One of the most notable being the infamous killer cult in Malaysia, known as the mysterious deaths of the Cempaka Hills. The case drew national and international attention due to the bizarre and chilling circumstances surrounding the murders, the involvement of a religious cult, and the apparent indifference of local authorities during the investigation. The events that unfolded during the late 1990s left many questioning the effectiveness of the law enforcement agencies, and raised concerns about the growing influence of cults and dangerous religious movements in the region. In early 1999, police in Malaysia were alerted to a series of strange and tragic deaths in the Cempaka Hills, a quiet rural area on the outskirts of Kuala Lumpur. The deaths appeared to be linked to a religious cult that had been operating in the region, drawing in vulnerable individuals with promises of spiritual enlightenment and wealth. At first, the deaths were dismissed by local authorities as isolated incidents, but as more bodies were discovered, it became clear that a far more sinister plot was unfolding. The first victim, Ahmad Zakaria, was a well-known businessman in his late 40s who had mysteriously disappeared for several days before his body was found in a secluded area of Cempaka Hills. Ahmad had been known for his involvement in local charity work and had reportedly been seeking spiritual guidance from a group that had recently gained prominence in the region. His body showed signs of violence, with deep gashes on his head and arms, leading authorities to suspect foul play. However, the lack of immediate evidence and the difficulty in identifying any potential suspects meant the case remained a mystery. As the weeks passed, more bodies were discovered in the same area, each victim showing signs of similar violence. A pattern quickly emerged. The victims were all linked to the Cempaka Hills cult, a religious movement led by a charismatic but enigmatic leader, Abdullah Ismail, who promised his followers wealth, protection, and spiritual enlightenment through a series of rituals. Members of the cult believed that Abdullah was a divine figure, sent to guide them toward financial prosperity and salvation. Abdullah's teachings were often steeped in esoteric and mystical concepts, blending Islamic teachings with bizarre rituals, which made his movement particularly appealing to disillusioned and vulnerable individuals. The deaths raised suspicions among local authorities that something more significant was taking place, and an official investigation was launched. During the investigation, it was discovered that the cult had a significant number of followers, many of whom were influential members of society, including businessmen, government officials, and university professors. The cult's influence seemed to reach into various corners of Malaysian society, with its members actively participating in secretive rituals and gatherings that were meant to strengthen their bond with Abdullah Ismail. In early May 1999, a breakthrough came when police received a tip from a former member of the cult, Nurayda Hassan, who claimed that she had witnessed a series of ritual killings orchestrated by Abdullah Ismail and his inner circle. According to Nurayda, the killings were part of a twisted belief held by the cult that human sacrifice would grant them power and prosperity. The cult members were led to believe that by offering lives to a higher power, they would be blessed with wealth and divine protection. Nurayda revealed that the ritual killings were often conducted in the dead of night, with the victims being lured to the Sempika Hills under the guise of participating in a spiritual cleansing ceremony. Nurayda's testimony sent shockwaves through the investigation. The police moved quickly to arrest several high-ranking members of the cult, including Abdullah Ismail, who was taken into custody for questioning. During his interrogation, Abdullah denied any involvement in the deaths, claiming that the deaths were either accidental or the result of internal conflicts within the cult. However, investigators soon uncovered evidence that contradicted Abdullah's claims, including disturbing recordings of cult meetings, where Abdullah can be heard instructing his followers to engage in dangerous rituals, including sacrifices. As the investigation unfolded, more details about the cult's activities were revealed. Abdullah Ismail had reportedly established a small commune in the Sempika Hills, where his followers lived in isolation, cut off from the outside world. Within the commune, the cult practiced rituals that involved fasting, chanting, and the consumption of hallucinogenic substances, which made them highly suggestible and susceptible to Abdullah's influence. The rituals often included symbolic acts of violence, and members were made to believe that they were purging evil spirits from their bodies. The idea of human sacrifice was introduced as a means to accelerate spiritual growth, and members of the cult were encouraged to volunteer for these sacrifices in exchange for financial rewards and promises of divine protection. It became clear that Abdullah had preyed on the desperation of his followers, convincing them that his teachings held the key to a better life. Many of the victims were from poor or disadvantaged backgrounds, and they had been promised that by joining the cult and participating in its rituals, they would experience a miraculous transformation in their lives. Unfortunately, the reality was much darker. The members of the cult had been manipulated into committing acts of violence, and they had been convinced that the murders were necessary sacrifices for their own spiritual and material gain. As the number of deaths mounted and the connections between the cult and high-profile members of society became more apparent, the case caused a public outcry in Malaysia. The media heavily covered the story, and people began to question how a cult with such dangerous beliefs could have flourished so openly for years without attracting serious scrutiny. Critics pointed to the government's inability to address the growing influence of religious extremism in cults, and many began to fear that similar movements might be operating under the radar in other parts of Southeast Asia. The Sempika Hills murder case was not only a shocking example of the dangers of religious extremism, but also exposed serious flaws in the ability of law enforcement to prevent and investigate cult-related crimes. Despite the fact that the cult had been active for several years, authorities had not acted with sufficient urgency to address the growing influence of Abdullah Ismail and his followers. There were also concerns about the role of corrupt officials and influential individuals who had been members of the cult and may have used their positions to shield it from scrutiny. As the trial of Abdullah Ismail and his followers began in late 1999, the true extent of the cult's activities continued to emerge. Many of the accused claimed that they had been brainwashed by Abdullah, and they expressed deep remorse for their involvement in the killings. Abdullah himself maintained his innocence, asserting that he had not orchestrated any murders, and that the deaths were a result of misunderstandings within the group. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming, and he was convicted on multiple charges, including murder, conspiracy, and incitement to commit violence. The case shocked Southeast Asia, drawing international attention to the dangers of religious cults and their ability to manipulate vulnerable individuals into committing horrific acts. The Sempika Hills cult murder case marked one of the most notorious and chilling criminal events in Malaysia's modern history. It served as a grim reminder of the power of charismatic leaders who prey on the vulnerable and the need for vigilant law enforcement to prevent such tragedies from occurring again. As the case came to a close, the people of Malaysia were left to grapple with the unsettling reality of how a dangerous religious cult could have operated so openly for years without intervention. The tragic deaths of the victims in Sempika Hills became a cautionary tale for the entire region, a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked religious extremism and the devastating consequences of blindly following charismatic leaders with malicious intentions. The aftermath of the Sempika Hills cult murder case left an indelible mark on Malaysia, not just in terms of the legal and political ramifications, but also in the broader societal understanding of the dangers posed by cults and extremist religious groups. The revelations surrounding Abdullah Ismail and his cult sent shockwaves through the country, highlighting the vulnerability of individuals to manipulation, especially when they are seeking answers to their personal struggles, whether spiritual or financial. In the years following the conviction of Abdullah Ismail and his followers, the case continued to resonate within both Malaysia and Southeast Asia at large. Government responses were mixed, with authorities acknowledging the need to address the growing influence of dangerous cults and extremist religious movements, but also facing pressure to improve the effectiveness of their investigations into such groups. The case also spurred a national conversation about the role of religion in society, especially when it came to unregulated fringe movements that could potentially exploit vulnerable individuals for personal gain. One of the most profound lessons from the Sempika Hills case was the realization that cults could operate under the radar for years, often disguised under the veil of religion or spiritual enlightenment. Abdullah Ismail had successfully positioned himself as a divine figure, tapping into the social and economic dissatisfaction of his followers. His ability to convince people, including those with respectable social status, to carry out brutal acts of violence was a stark reminder of how powerful such belief systems could be when left unchecked. In Malaysia, there was a significant shift in public awareness about the dangers of these types of religious movements. Religious authorities began to acknowledge the need for greater oversight of religious groups and organizations. Malaysia's Department of Islamic Development, JACM, and other religious bodies became more proactive in monitoring unregistered religious organizations, ensuring that they were not engaging in dangerous or extremist practices. However, critics argued that the authorities were still slow to adapt to the evolving nature of such movements, which were becoming increasingly sophisticated in their ability to operate covertly. The media's role in the case also raised questions about how sensationalism might contribute to public fear, but it also highlighted the crucial role of investigative journalism in uncovering the truth behind the cult's activities. The intense media coverage kept the case in the public eye and pressured law enforcement to pursue justice in a manner that ensured a degree of accountability. As the story unfolded, it became clear that the broader region was paying attention, and many neighboring Southeast Asian nations expressed concern that similar cults could be thriving in their own countries. At the same time, the case revealed some critical issues related to law enforcement procedures in Malaysia. Critics pointed to the fact that many of the early signs of cult activities were dismissed by local authorities until it was too late. The slow response of the police in fully investigating the deaths initially led to public outcry, and many began questioning the competence of the law enforcement agencies involved. Some members of the Malaysian public believed that the authorities were too complacent, failing to realize the potential danger posed by Abdullah Ismail's growing influence. This led to calls for stronger coordination between religious bodies, police, and intelligence services in monitoring and addressing religious movements that could pose a threat to public safety. On the international front, the Sempika Hills cult case sparked concerns across Southeast Asia and beyond. Religious extremism was already a growing issue in many countries, and this case exposed how easily charismatic leaders could amass a following by exploiting the fears and anxieties of their followers. In Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines, authorities became more vigilant in monitoring cults and extremist religious movements, some of which had ties to criminal activities. Although such groups had been less visible in these countries, the tragedy in Malaysia highlighted that similar incidents could occur if left unaddressed. In Malaysia, the aftermath of the Sempika Hills case also saw legal reforms intended to prevent the rise of similar cults in the future. New laws were proposed to regulate religious organizations more tightly, requiring all religious groups to register with the government and comply with national standards. Some groups, particularly from the more liberal factions of Malaysian society, viewed these measures as potentially infringing on personal freedoms and religious rights, sparking debates about the balance between security and individual liberties. Yet, for many, the need for safeguards to protect vulnerable individuals from the dangers of radicalization and manipulation was paramount. Additionally, mental health services and social support systems began to receive more attention in the wake of the murders. Experts argued that many cult members were not inherently bad people, but were simply victims of psychological manipulation. The case underscored the need for better social safety nets, psychological counseling, and educational programs to help individuals recognize and resist the emotional and psychological traps set by cult leaders. Such services were especially important for young people or individuals facing personal or financial crises, as they were often the most vulnerable targets for these groups. As for Abdullah Ismail and his inner circle, their convictions served as a reminder of the potential consequences of blind belief and manipulation. Abdullah himself remained defiant, refusing to admit any wrongdoing, even as evidence mounted against him. His trial became a focal point for discussions about justice and accountability in Malaysia. Many believed that while Abdullah's conviction was an important first step, it was not enough. His supporters, although small in number, continued to rally around him, claiming he had been misunderstood and unfairly targeted. This resistance added a layer of complexity to the case, demonstrating how deeply some individuals were entangled in the cult's beliefs, even in the face of undeniable evidence. The legacy of the Cempaka Hills cult murders continued to echo through Malaysian society. For many years after the trials had concluded, the case revealed the dangers of unchecked extremism, the vulnerabilities of those in search of spiritual meaning, and the dark potential for charismatic leaders to exploit these vulnerabilities. It served as a crucial learning point for Malaysia, Southeast Asia, and the wider world about the need for greater vigilance against dangerous cults, the importance of mental health and support services, and the responsibility of governments and societies to protect their citizens from manipulation. In the broader historical context, the Cempaka Hills case marked a significant turning point in Southeast Asia's understanding of religious extremism. It was a stark reminder of how quickly a movement could turn deadly when placed in the hands of the wrong leader. As Malaysia moved forward, it became evident that the lessons learned from this dark chapter in the nation's history would shape the way the country addressed religious movements and cults in the future. The tragedy was not only a national crisis, but a reminder that vigilance, education, and a strong legal framework were essential to prevent similar incidents from unfolding again.